Can we agree that John Jay was a bad writer? He was boring as fuck. Yeah, maybe. Compared to Madison, at least. Yeah, I don't know. But maybe, have we read, did Hamilton write a couple of these? Hamilton seems like cool. Wait, I shouldn't have said Madison. I'm so sorry. Hamilton was, I feel like he wrote better than John Jay. Give us a preview. What's the Bridges Roundtable about? Oh, you don't want to watch that because we already live streamed that. You've already seen that. Don't worry about that. That's just for that channel. Okay. The importance of the Union in a commercial light is one of those points about which there is least room to entertain a difference of opinion, and which has, in fact, commanded the most general assent of men who have any acquaintance with the subject. This applies as well to our intercourse with foreign countries as with each other. Basically, anybody that knows shit knows that we have to have one federal government. There are appearances to authorize a supposition that the adventurous spirit, which distinguishes the commercial charter of America, has already excited uneasy sensations in several of the maritime powers of Europe. Other countries are basically worried that we're kind of looking like we might do some wild shit, like make 4 countries, which is cringe. It's not the roundtable, it's the podcast with Matt Brunig. Oh, maybe the Brunig one is what drops tonight then. It's just labeled wrong on the calendar. They seem to be, the other countries, apprehensive of our too great interference in that carrying trade. They seem to be apprehensive of our too great interference in that carrying trade, which is the support of their navigation, the foundation of their naval strength. Those of them who have colonies in America look forward to what this country is capable of becoming with painful solicitude. They foresee the dangers that may threaten their American dominions from the neighborhood of states, which have all the dispositions and would possess all the means requisite to the creation of a powerful marine. Impressions of this kind will naturally indicate the policy of fostering divisions among us and of depriving us, as far as possible, of an active commerce in our own bottoms. This would answer the threefold purpose of preventing our interference in their navigation, of monopolizing the profits of our trade, and of clipping the wings by which we might soar to a dangerous greatness. Did not prudence forbid the detail, it would not be difficult to trace by facts the workings of this policy to the cabinets of ministers. One of the things in Federalist Papers 1 through 10 that these guys talk about is that if we become 4 separate countries, because some people are arguing for 3 or 4 confederations, or just like all the colonies being individual, the thing that would happen that you'd have to be really concerned about are other countries coming in and trying to get influence or favor with some of the confederacies to fight with the other ones. And that's basically leaning into that idea. If we continue united, we may counteract a policy so unfriendly to our prosperity in a variety of ways. By prohibitory regulations extending at the same time throughout the states, we may oblige foreign countries to bid against each other for the privileges of our markets. A unified market, financial integration, kind of like what the European Union did, but we did it first. This assertion will not appear chimerical to those who are able to appreciate the importance of the markets of 3 millions of people, increasing in rapid progression, for the most part exclusively addicted to agriculture, and likely from local circumstances to remain so, to any manufacturing nation, and the immense difference there would be on the trade to the trade and navigation of such a nation between a direct communication in its own ships and an indirect conveyance of its products and returns to and from America in the ships of another country. Suppose, for instance, that we had a government in America capable of excluding Great Britain, with whom we have at present no treaty of commerce, from all of our ports. What would be the probable operation of this step upon her politics? Would it not enable us to negotiate with the fairest prospect of success for commercial privileges of the most valuable and extensive kind in the dominions of that kingdom? When these questions have been asked upon other occasions, they have received a plausible but not a solid or satisfactory answer. It has been said that prohibitions on our part would produce no change in the system of Britain because she could prosecute her trade with us through the medium of the Dutch, who would be her immediate customers and paymasters for those articles which were wanted for the supply of our markets. But would not her navigation be materially injured by the loss of the important advantage of being her own carrier in that trade? Would not the principal part of its profits be intercepted by the Dutch as a compensation for their agency and risk? Would not the mere circumstance of freight occasion a considerable deduction? Would not so circuitous an intercourse facilitate the competitions of other nations by enhancing the price of British commodities in our markets and by transferring to other hands the management of this interesting branch of the British commerce. So basically saying that, like, if we are all one unified people, we could fuck over the certain or we could fuck over certain countries by saying we're not going to trade with you. And then other people are like, oh, well, what if they just like trade to the Dutch first or whatever? And it's like, well, they could do that, but obviously people are going to charge a markup to the Brits for that. These aren't like the integrated economies of the 2000s that we're in today, right? Like they'd get fucked with that, and people would make money off them, and they get cucked. A mature consideration of the objects suggested by these questions will justify a belief that the real disadvantages to Britain from such a state of things, conspiring with the prepossessions of a great part of the nation in favor of the American trade, and with the importunities of the West India Islands, would produce a relaxation in her present system, and would let us into the enjoyment of privileges in the markets of those islands elsewhere, from which our trade would derive the most substantial benefits. Such a point gained from the British government, and which could not be expected without an equivalent in exemptions and immunities in our markets, would be likely to have a correspondent effect on the conduct of other nations, who would not be inclined to see themselves altogether supplanted in our trade. Our power, our might would mean the British were like, okay, well, fuck it. Yeah, we should make a deal with America to trade with them, and that'd be great. And then other countries would obviously, they'd follow suit, right? Who wants to be an enemy to a big trade partner, you know? A further resource for influencing the conduct of European nations towards us, in this respect, would arise from the establishment of a federal navy. There can be no doubt that the continuance of the Union under an efficient government would put it in our power, at a period not very distant, to create a navy which, if it could not vie with those of the great maritime powers, would at least be of respectable weight if thrown into the scale of either of two contending parties. This would be more peculiarly, Jesus. This would be more peculiarly the case. This would be more peculiarly the case in relation to operations in the West Indies. Ugh. A few ships of the line, sent opportunely to the reinforcement of either side, would often be sufficient to decide the fate of a campaign, on the event of which interests of the greatest magnitude were suspended. Our position is, in this respect, a most commanding one. And if to this consideration we add that of the usefulness of supplies from this country in the prosecution of military operations in the West Indies, it will readily be perceived that a situation so favorable would enable us to bargain with great advantage for commercial privileges. A price would be set not only upon our friendship, but upon our neutrality. By a steady adherence to the Union, we may hope, ere long, to become the arbiter of Europe in America, and to be able to incline the balance of European competitions in this part of the world as our interest may dictate. That's a pretty prescient paragraph. It's pretty interesting. So they're talking about, like, we don't want to have separate governments because, like, the French or the British or whoever might come in and, like, play one side, and now we'll get fucked. And then now we're talking about, like, hey, well, in European politics, we could play one side, right? America, we're, like, really far away. We don't have to be strong enough to beat the French or the British. We just have to be strong enough that if we lend our aid to either one, they could defeat the other person with ease, basically, right? Which I guess is kind of what America did 200 or 150 years later. But in the reverse of this eligible situation, we shall discover that the rival ships of the parts would make them checks upon each other, and would frustrate all the tempting advantages which nature has kindly placed within our reach. In a state so insignificant, our commerce would be a prey to the wanton intermeddlings of all nations at war with each other, who, having nothing to fear from us, would, with little scruple or remorse, supply their wants by depredations on our property as often as it fell their way. The rights of neutrality will only be respected when they are defended by an adequate power. A nation, despicable by its weakness, forfeits even the privilege of being neutral. So, like, how can you be neutral if you're too weak? Because somebody will just come in and fuck your shit up, basically, right? Under a vigorous national government, the natural strength and resources of the country, directed to a common interest, would baffle all the combinations of European jealousy to restrain our growth. This situation would even take away the motive to such combinations by inducing an impracticability of success. An active commerce, an extensive navigation, and a flourishing marine would then be the offspring of moral and physical necessity. We might defy the little arts of the little politicians to control or vary the irresistible and unchangeable course of nature. Oh, that's interesting. This is an argument then for a strong military, basically, without necessarily doing war, right? And even a moral one, right? An active commerce, us trading with other people, an extensive navigation, our ability to send ships around the world, and a flourishing marine, right, having a strong and powerful navy, would then be the offspring of moral and physical necessity. If you want to have a nation that produces as much good for all of its population, like that's a moral position, right? And the physical needs of your people, then the offspring of that moral and physical necessity would be a strong navy, good trade, and the ability to navigate the world's waters, right? Okay, sorry. But in a state of disunion, these combinations might exist and might operate with success. It would be in the power of the maritime nations, availing themselves of our universal impotence, to prescribe the conditions of our political existence, and as they have a common interest in being our carriers, and still more in preventing our becoming theirs, they would, in all probability, combine to embarrass our navigation in such a manner as would in effect destroy it and confine us to a passive commerce. We should then be compelled to content ourselves with the first price of our commodities, and to see the profits of our trade snatched from us to enrich our enemies and persecutors. That unequaled spirit of enterprise which signalizes the genius of the American merchants and navigators, and which is in itself an inexhaustible mine of national wealth, would be stifled and lost, and poverty and disgrace would overspread a country which, with wisdom, might make herself the admiration and envy of the world. There are rights of great moment to the trade of America, which are rights of the Union. There are rights of great moment to the trade of America, which are rights of the Union. I allude to the fisheries, to the navigation, the western lakes, and to that of the Mississippi. The dissolution of the Confederacy would give room for delicate questions concerning the future existence of these rights, which the interest of more powerful partners would hardly fail to solve to our disadvantage. So kind of funny. You think of like the backstop in Ireland, right? That like this is a very difficult thing to solve. If you're all part of like one giant fucking body, you're all part of the European Union, whatever, it's whatever. We're all part of one thing. We can figure this out. But as soon as you become more divided, questions of like geographic advantage become much more difficult to answer, right? Because you don't have a collective body that all, basically gains from everybody having access to these things without question. The disposition of Spain with regard to the Mississippi needs no comment. France and Britain are concerned with us and the fisheries and view them as of the utmost moment to their navigation. They, of course, would hardly remain long indifferent to that decided mastery, of which experience has shown us to be possessed in this valuable branch of traffic, and by which we are able to undersell those nations in their own markets. What more natural than that they should be disposed to exclude from the list such dangerous competitors? Basically, like American, I guess our fisheries were really good. I guess we had good fishermen. Is that an American thing, I guess? So why wouldn't Britain and France try to fuck us over, right? One would say it would be natural. What could be more natural? This branch of trade ought not be considered as a partial benefit. All the navigating states may, in different degrees, advantageously participate in it, and under circumstances of a greater extension of mercantile capital would not be unlikely to do it. As a nursery of seamen, it now is, or when time shall have more nearly assimilated the principles of navigation in the several states, will become a universal resource. To the establishment of a navy, it must be indispensable. To this great national object, a union will contribute in various ways. Every institution will grow and flourish in proportion to the quantity and extent of the means concentrated towards its formation and support. A navy of the United States, as it would embrace the resources of all, is an object far less remote than a navy of any single state or partial confederacy, which would only embrace the resources of a single part. It happens, indeed, that different portions of confederated America possess each other some peculiar advantage for this essential establishment. The more southern states, look at how much shit these guys know. Look at this. Comparative advantage, right? Different parts of the Union will be good at building different parts of the Navy or for different reasons, and all of us benefit like in some kind of way from having a strong Navy. Every state would participate in our trade and our mercantile systems and our fisheries. Like everybody's like bought into this common idea of the United States of America. Everybody can contribute in some way. Everybody can gain an advantage in some way. How cute. Wow. It happens indeed that different portions of confederated America possess each some peculiar advantage for this essential establishment. The more southern states furnish in greater abundance certain kinds of naval stores, tar, pitch, and turpentine. Their wood for the construction of ships is also of a more solid and lasting texture. The difference in the duration of the ships of which the Navy might be composed, if chiefly constructed of southern wood, would be of signal importance, either in the view of naval strength or of national economy. Some of the southern and of the middle states yield a greater plenty of iron and of better quality. Seamen must chiefly be drawn from the northern hive. The necessity of naval protection to external or maritime commerce does not require a particular elucidation, no more than the conduciveness of that species of commerce to the prosperity of a navy. The necessity of naval protection to external or maritime commerce does not require particular elucidation, no more than the conduciveness of that species of commerce. Okay, so basically that like everybody would benefit from having this Navy. Everybody needs it. You shouldn't have to make a special argument for each person or whatever. But like the whole country's kind of like brought in, I think, or bought into the existence of a Navy to protect trade and navigation and to bully people that are trying to bully you. An unrestrained intercourse between the states themselves will advance the trade of each by an interchange of their respective productions, not only for the supply of reciprocal wants at home, but for exportation to foreign markets. The veins of commerce in every part will be replenished and will acquire additional motion and vigor from a free circulation of the commodities of every part. Commercial enterprise will have much greater scope from the diversity in the productions of different states. When the staple of one fails from a bad harvest or unproductive crop, it can call to its aid the staple of another. The variety, not less than the value, of products for exportation contributes to the activity of foreign commerce. It can be conducted upon much better terms with a large number of materials of a given value than with a small number of materials of the same value, arising from the competitions of trade and from the fluctuations of markets. Particular articles may be in great demand at certain periods and unsaleable to others or at others, but if there be a variety of articles, it can scarcely happen that they should all be at one time in the latter predicament, and on this account, the operations of the merchant would be less liable to any considerable obstruction or stagnation. Basically, greater volume means less volatility. You're doing more things. Look at this. They're trying to. One of the things that's interesting about like the two-tiered, like the federal versus the state government, I would say it's basically it's like a Hegelian dialectic. I would say, where the state governments are they represent the thesis, and the federal government is the antithesis. And through integration and synthesis, we produce something greater. The United States of America. Sorry. The speculative trader will at once perceive the force of these observations and will acknowledge that the aggregate balance of the commerce of the United States would bid to be much more favorable than that of the 13 states without union or with partial unions. True. It may perhaps be replied to this, that whether the states are united or disunited, there would still be an intimate intercourse between them, which would answer the same ends. This intercourse would be fettered, interrupted, and narrowed by a multiplicity of causes, which in the course of these papers have been amply detailed. A unity of commercial as well as political interests can only result from a unity of government. There are other points of view in which the subject might be placed of a striking and animating kind, but they would lead us too far into the regions of futurity, and would involve topics not proper for a newspaper discussion. I shall briefly observe that our situation invites and our interests prompt us to aim at an ascendant in the system of American affairs. The world may politically as well as geographically be divided into 4 parts, each having a distinct set of interests. Unhappily for the other 3, Europe, by her arms and by her negotiations, by force and by fraud, has, in different degrees, extended her dominion over them all. Africa, Asia, and America have successfully felt her domination. The superiority that she has long maintained has tempted her to plume herself as the mistress of the world and to consider the rest of mankind as created for her benefit. You know what? I just realized something. When people talk about, especially leftists, when people talk about like colonialism and imperialism and all that shit, why the fuck does America get lumped in with you fuckers in Europe? That's kind of bullshit, isn't it? Like, Britain and France, you guys like colonized a whole metric fuck ton of people, and you did a lot of fucky shit in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, and in America. Why are we included? When people talk about like Western colonialists, why does America have to get lumped in with you guys? Fuck you. Men admired, as profound philosophers have, in direct terms, attributed to her inhabitants a physical superiority and have gravely asserted that all animals, and with them the human species, degenerate in America, that even dogs cease to bark after having breathed a while in our atmosphere. Facts have too long supported these arrogant pretensions of the Europeans. It belongs to us to vindicate the honor of the human race and to teach that assuming brother moderation. True. We need to humble these Brit fucks, okay? Over and over again. Union will enable us to do it. Disunion will add another victim to his triumphs. Let Americans disdain to be the instruments of European greatness. Let the 13 states, bound together in a strict and indissoluble union, concur in erecting one great American system, superior to the control of all transatlantic force or influence, and able to dictate the terms of the connection between the old and the new world. True. And based. The utility of the Union in respect to commercial relations and a navy. Hamilton argues in this essay that having a strong Union produces the best outcomes insofar as having strong trade, global navigation, and leverage to maintain peace or neutrality with other nations. Nations would be more easily able to divide us against each other or play sides with us if we were separate countries, and we are able to take advantage of their divisions more easily if we are united. Couldn't they do the same with parties instead? I think a lot of these guys didn't like political parties, right? Wasn't that like a thing? You may notice they talk a lot about the Mississippi because at the time it was almost impossible to get crops from inland to the cities of the coast. Access to the Mississippi allows for goods to be floated down the river into the Atlantic coast faster than overland. Well, yeah, I mean, they talk about like sharing because the Mississippi is one, and I think there's one or two other ports as well, that there's very uneven access between the states to some natural like advantages. And so if they break out into confederacies, that's going to be a big problem, because some of the confederates are going to be like, well, fuck you. Like, you're going to charge us for access to the New York like harbors, or we're going to have to, we can't transport our shit up and down the Mississippi because we're going to fight like people. It's, yeah. So this, and I mean, like, it's a good solution, right? Okay, fine. We have state governments, fine, but let's be one united federal government so we don't have to fight over this bullshit, you know? Yeah. This is discussed in Federalist 10. Sure. We already read Federalist 10. We just got through 11. Logistics thing I was going to do. We'll do that, but let me just do one more. I want to do at least one of these Federalist Papers a day. Wait, can you debunk Fuentes citing Federalist Paper No. 1 in defense of an ethno-state several years ago, now that you've read some?
Just in the United States, in the first Federalist paper, which is, you know, if you're familiar with the Federalist Papers, was John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. They wrote a series of essays to justify the new Constitution of the United States, which was up for ratification in 1787, got ratified in 1788. And John Jay wrote in the first Federalist paper this, and it's a pretty long quote, but I think it's important to establish. He said, quote, "Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs. This country and this people seem to have been made for each other." So now, I can understand why you would think it'd be shaky logic to say that the preamble, because it says we give this government to ourselves and our posterity, why that might exclude immigration. But in the first Federalist paper to justify the Constitution, John Jay, the first Supreme Court justice, explicitly lays out what posterity means.
That's cute. Okay, I understand now, yeah. So so now with more context, I'm not even sure how I refute this. If this is my first conversation, I don't think I refute almost anything. I don't know what is in my second conversation. But the full refutation of this is the Federalist Papers were written to convince the United States of America to form a single coherent government rather than 3 or 4 confederacies or remaining separated. So of course, any writing here is going to harp on our similarities as much as possible, obviously. But to cite that as being in favor of an ethno-state, when that has literally nothing to do with what the subject matter, what none of the Federalist Papers were about. We need to be one common racial group. That's like such a bastardized misquotation of that's just a very, very, very poor citation. That's just a very poor citation of the underlying material. But I mean, I think that ended up being true for most of the stuff of his that I researched anyway when I came back for the second debate. But John Jay didn't write the first Federalist paper. Oh, that's true too. The very first one might have been Hamilton. Yeah, John Jay wrote the next 6, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, the next 4. And then Hamilton went back, and then I think we get Madison, yeah. Because Jay got sick like a loser after like 4 and stopped writing. Have you listened to Hamilton? Nope. I should try to take one quote from each of these as well, just because it's nice. It's always nice to have quotes. This was a good one. Destiny is on the Gaza Genocide Defenders of Blue Sky block list. Based. Weird audio glitch. Yeah, it was probably because I pulled back my mic and the cord was like starting to come out. That'd be my guess. Something like that happened. Okay. Federalist number 12. Uh-oh. This sounds like it's gonna be about taxes. Not good. The utility of the Union in respect to revenue. The effects of union upon the commercial prosperity of the states have been sufficiently delineated. Its tendency to promote the interests of revenue will be the subject of our present inquiry. The prosperity of commerce is now perceived and acknowledged by all enlightened statesmen to be the most useful as well as the most productive source of national wealth, and has accordingly become a primary object of their political cares. By multiplying the means of gratification, by promoting the introduction and circulation of the precious metals, those darling objects of human avarice and enterprise, it serves to vivify and invigorate the channels of industry, and to make them flow with greater activity and copiousness. The assiduous merchant, the laborious husbandman, the active mechanic, and the industrious manufacturer all orders of men look forward with eager expectation and growing alacrity to this pleasing reward of their toils. The often agitated question between agriculture and commerce has, from indubitable experience, received a decision which has silenced the rivalship that once subsisted between them, and has proved, to the satisfaction of their friends, that their interests are intimately blended and interwoven. I think it's basically just saying, like, hey, trade is good. When we say commerce, we're referring to trade, I'm guessing, right? As commerce is trade. So trade is good. Trade with other nations is good. Trade through all of our lands is good. Like, trade is good for everybody, too. Everybody benefits from trade. Cute. Globalist arguments, I think. Assuming that's what commerce is meaning here. It has been found in various countries that, in proportion as commerce has flourished, land has risen in value. And how could it have happened? Otherwise? Could that which procures a freer vent for the products of the earth, which furnishes new incitements to the cultivation of land, which is the most powerful instrument in increasing the quantity of money in a state, could that, in fine, which is the faithful handmaid of labor and industry in every shape, fail to augment that article, which is the prolific parent of far the greatest part of the objects upon which they are exerted? Basically that, like, right? Like if you're grabbing shit from the earth, if you're like mining shit, if you're farming shit, if you're doing all this, like being able to sell it or ship it or send it to other people is like based, I think, basically. I don't know the context for a lot of this. Someone in chat said, free commerce was kind of a revolutionary ideal because of British imperial mercantilism. That might be it as well. So maybe free trade and all that's just becoming like a big thing. Yeah. It is astonishing that so simple a truth should ever have had an adversary. And it is one among a multitude of proofs how apt a spirit of ill-informed jealousy or of too great abstraction and refinement is to lead men astray from the plainest truths of reason and conviction. The ability of a country to pay taxes must always be proportioned, in a great degree, to the quantity of money in circulation and to the celerity with which it circulates. Commerce, contributing to both these objects, must of necessity render the payment of taxes easier and facilitate the requisite supplies to the treasury. The hereditary dominions of the Emperor of Germany contain a great extent of fertile, cultivated, and populous territory, a large proportion of which is situated in mild and luxuriant climates. In some parts of this territory are to be found the best gold and silver mines in Europe. And yet, from the want of the fostering influence of commerce, that monarch can boast but slender revenues. He has several times been compelled to owe obligations to the pecuniary succors of other nations for the preservation of his essential interests, and is unable, upon the strength of his own resources, to sustain a long or continued war. I think it's basically saying that, like, having even if a country or an emperor might own a lot of land or a lot of natural resources, like because everybody's like buying and selling and trading with each other, like you still kind of have to participate in these global markets or else you fall behind, basically. Even though they've got the best gold and silver mines, the monarch can only have but slender revenues because of the fostering influence of commerce, and then the monarch is compelled to owe obligations to the, what does this word mean? Hold on.
Pecuniary.
Relating to okay. Succors. Succors. Is it succor? Or
Succor.
Succors, yeah. Of other nations for the preservation of his essential interests, and is unable upon the strength of his own resources to sustain a longer continued war. I think we're becoming like more interdependent and more, yeah. Oh wait, Destiny split VOD. Oh shit, can I? I hope this works. Good luck. Fuck. Wait, hopefully that's uploaded. Good luck. Okay, sorry. But it is not in this aspect of the subject alone that union will be seen to conduce to the purpose of revenue. There are other points of view in which its influence will appear more immediate and decisive. It is evident from the state of the country, from the habits of the people, from the experience that we have had on the point itself, that it is impracticable to raise any very considerable sums by direct taxation. Tax laws have in vain been multiplied, new methods to enforce the collection have in vain been tried, the public expectation has been uniformly disappointed, and the treasuries of the state have remained empty. The popular system of administration inherent in the nature of popular government, coinciding with the real scarcity of money, incident to a languid and mutilated state of trade, has hitherto defeated every experiment for extensive collections and has at length taught the different legislatures the folly of attempting them. No person acquainted with what happens in other countries will be surprised at this circumstance. In so opulent a nation as that of Britain, where direct taxes from superior wealth must be much more tolerable, and from the vigor of the government much more practicable than in America, far the greatest part of the national revenue is derived from taxes of the indirect kind, from imposts and from excises. Duties on imported articles form a large branch of this latter description. It's the Trump taxes. He's saying we can't really raise income taxes, like nobody wants to pay that shit. And even in Britain, where the crown can go after it, they're still not collecting that shit. So we have to put duties and import taxes on stuff. In America, it is evident that we must a long time depend for the means of revenue chiefly on such duties. Duty is another name, I believe, for like import and maybe export taxes, but maybe import taxes. Duties imported. Okay. I think we've already I think at this point we've even had, I think this already happened before the Constitution was even, in response to the stamp tax or a tax that they tried to do. I don't remember. Oh yeah, to the state government's increased efforts to collect taxes on both individuals and their trades. Constitution ratified, and we did the Constitution in 1788. This was 1786. Do you think the stock markets have already priced in Trump's tariffs? No, I think the stock markets are assuming it's not going to happen. I think most people, even I would assume that hopefully that, okay. In America, it is evident that we must a long time depend for the means of revenue chiefly on such duties. In most parts of it, excises must be confined within a narrow compass. The genius of the people will ill brook the inquisitive and peremptory spirit of excise laws. The pockets of the farmers, on the other hand, will reluctantly yield but scanty supplies in the unwelcome shape of impositions on their houses and lands, and personal property is too precarious and invisible a fund to be laid hold of in any other way than by the imperceptible agency of taxes on consumption. So basically, whatever we tax, it's got to be like a pretty narrow tax because people are going to find ways to get around it, right? People are smart, they'll get around it. Farmers are fucked, though, because like, how are they going to get around it if it's just like agricultural products, I guess, that they're shipping out? So that's not good, right? You'd have like uneven treatment here, I guess. If these remarks have any foundation, that state of things which will best enable us to improve and extend so valuable a resource must be best adapted to our political welfare. And it cannot admit of a serious doubt that this state of things must rest on the basis of a general union. As far as this would be conducive to the interests of commerce, so far it must tend to the extension of the revenues to be drawn from that source. As far as it would contribute to rendering regulations for the collection of the duties more simple and efficacious, so far it must serve to answer the purposes of making the same rate of duties more productive and of putting it into the power of the government to increase the rate without prejudice to trade. So I'm speaking a little bit out of my area of expertise because I don't know any of the history. But I think that even as early as the colonies, you still had this huge difference between, or when they even say in the earlier Federalist Papers, the northern people are fishermen, they're merchants, they want to do commerce, like higher level like goods and buying and selling. Like that's what the North does. And the South is still like slaves, agriculture, like it's two very different economies. And two different styles of economies. And the idea of making the Union part of the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, everything else, is trying to assuage the South of saying like, hey, listen, we're not going to fuck your shit up. Like we know that the North has a different style of economy, and we know that the South is different, but we're all going to try to work together and make this like balance between both sides. Like shit's not going to be like super fucked. Okay. There's arguments that taxation needs to be done effectively in regards to commerce. Agriculture, so one side isn't disfavored. The relative situation of these states, the number of rivers with which they are intersected, and of bays that wash their shores, the facility of communication in every direction, the affinity of language and manners, the familiar habits of intercourse, all these are circumstances that would conspire to render an illicit trade between them a matter of little difficulty, and would ensure frequent evasions of the commercial regulations of each other. The separate states or confederacies would be necessitated by mutual jealousy to avoid the temptations to that kind of trade by the lowness of their duties. The temper of our governments for a long time to come would not permit those rigorous precautions by which the European nations guard the avenues into their respective countries, as well by land as by water, and which, even there, are found insufficient obstacles to the adventurous stratagems of avarice. Oh, I think this argument here is like, okay, listen, if you really do try to make 4 countries, if we do 4 confederacies here instead of the United States, literally nobody's going to pay taxes. Like, people are going to find so many ways around this. How are you going to tax people coming out of the north who are going to like hide in like through different rivers or different paths? Like, there's just never going to work. But if we're all just one country, we don't have to pay like taxes going between the states. I think is like the argument here, basically, right? In France, there is an army of patrols, as they are called, constantly employed to secure their fiscal regulations against the inroads of the dealers in contraband trade. Mr. Neckar computes the number of these patrols at upwards of 20,000. This shows the immense difficulty in preventing that species of traffic where there is an inland communication and places in a strong light the disadvantages with which the collection of duties in this country would be encumbered. If by disunion the states should be placed in a situation with respect to each other resembling that of France with respect to her neighbors, the arbitrary and vexatious powers with which the patrols are necessarily armed would be intolerable in a free country. Contraband and illegal trade would it necessarily occur and thrive? It would require immensely powerful patrols, as in France, to stop. If, on the contrary, there be but one government pervading all the states, there will be, as to the principal part of our commerce, but one side to guard, the Atlantic coast. Vessels arriving directly from foreign countries, laden with valuable cargoes, would rarely choose to hazard themselves to the complicated and critical perils which would attend attempts to unlade prior to their coming into port. They would have to dread both the dangers of the coast and of detection, as well after as before their arrival at the places of their final destination. An ordinary degree of vigilance would be competent to the prevention of any material infractions upon the rights of the revenue. A few armed vessels, judiciously stationed at the entrances of our ports, might at a small expense be made useful sentinels of the laws. The government having the same interest to provide against violations everywhere, the cooperation of its measure in each state would have a powerful tendency to render them effectual. Here, also, we should preserve by union an advantage which nature holds out to us, and which would be relinquished by separation. The United States lie at a great distance from Europe, and at a considerable distance from all other places with which they would have extensive connections of foreign trade. The passage from them to us in a few hours or in a single night, as between the coasts of France and Britain, and of other neighboring nations, would be impracticable. This is a prodigious security against a direct contraband with foreign countries, but a circuitous contraband to one state through the medium of one another would be both easy and safe. Circuitous? Circuitous. The difference between a direct importation from abroad and an indirect importation through the channel of a neighboring state in small parcels, according to time and opportunity, with the additional facilities of inland communication, must be palpable to every man of discernment. Basically saying that, like, if we're different countries, obviously it'd be easier to sneak shit in, but if we're like one country, that would be much more difficult, right? Yeah. For foreign powers. It is therefore evident that one national government would be able, at much less expense, to extend the duties on imports, beyond comparison, further than would be practicable to the states separately or to any partial confederacies. Hitherto, I believe, it may safely be asserted that these duties have not upon an average exceeded in any state 3%. In France, they are estimated to be about 15%, and in Britain, they exceed this proportion. There seems to be nothing to hinder their being increased in this country to at least treble their present amount. The single article of ardent spirits under federal regulation might be made to furnish a considerable revenue. Upon a ratio to the importation into this state, the whole quantity imported into the United States may be estimated at 4 millions of gallons, at a shilling per gallon, would produce 200,000 pounds. That article would well bear this rate of duty, and if it should tend to diminish the consumption of it, such an effect would be equally favorable to the agriculture, to the economy, to the morals, and to the health of our society. There is perhaps nothing so much a subject of national extravagance as these spirits. So basically, we can tax shit coming in, it'll be easy to make a lot of money, and if people consume less of it, then it'll help our domestic production. Wow, the Trump arguments for taxation. What is a screenshot? This isn't actually happening, right? Oh, that happened during DGG movies. Nice. What will be the consequence? We are not able to avail ourselves of the resource in question in its full extent. A nation cannot long exist without revenues. Destitute of this essential support, it must resign its independence and sink into the degraded condition of a province. This is an extremity to which no government will of choice accede. Revenue, therefore, must be had at all events. In this country, if the principal part be not drawn from commerce, it must fall with oppressive weight upon land. It has been already intimated that excises, in their true significance, are too little in unison with the feelings of the people to admit of great use being made of that mode of taxation. Nor, indeed, in the states where almost the sole employment is agriculture, are the objects proper for excise sufficiently numerous to permit very ample collections in that way. Basically, like, obviously the North and the South both favor very different modes of taxation, and one would greatly benefit one, greatly hurt the other, right? Personal estate, as has been remarked, from the difficulty in tracing it, cannot be subjected to large contributions by any other means than by taxes on consumption. In populous cities, it may be enough, the subject of conjecture, to occasion the oppression of individuals without much aggregate benefit to the state, but beyond these circles, it must, in a great measure, escape the eye and the hand of the tax gatherer. As the necessities of the state, nevertheless, must be satisfied in some mode or other, the defect of other resources must throw the principal weight of public burdens on the possessors of land. And as, on the other hand, the wants of the government can never obtain an adequate supply unless all the sources of revenue are open to its demands, the finances of the community under such embarrassments cannot be put into a situation consistent with its respectability or its security. Thus, we shall not even have the consolations of a full treasury to atone for the oppression of that valuable class of the citizens who are employed in the cultivation of the soil, but public and private distress will keep pace with each other in gloomy concert and unite in deploring the infatuation of those councils which led to disunion. I don't know if the lyric's gonna fuck me up or not. Federalist number 13. Advantage of the Union in respect to economy in government. How many of the rest are written by Hamilton versus like the other people? Are all the rest of the through 20 written by Hamilton and Madison? Cute. Okay, this is super gonna distract. As connected with the subject of revenue, we may with propriety consider that of economy. As connected with the subject of revenue, anytime, at least so far in the Federalist Papers, when revenue is brought up, revenue means tax revenue of the federal government. Or maybe states government as well, but it usually is referring to tax revenue, is what we've seen so far. As connected with the subject of revenue, we may, with propriety, consider that of economy. The money saved from one object may be usefully applied to another, and there will be so much the less to be drawn from the pockets of the people. Basically, if an economy can be so prosperous, you don't have to tax them as much because there's so much money basically flowing through, right? If the states are united under one government, there will be but one national civil list to support. If they are divided into several confederacies, there will be as many different national civil lists to be provided for, and each of them, as to the principal departments, coextensive with that which would be necessary for a government of the whole. The entire separation of the states into 13 unconnected sovereignties is a project too extravagant and too replete with the danger to have many advocates. Basically, if you have to duplicate the federal government between 3 or 4 confederacies or between 13 things, it's just a lot of wasted money on government, I guess. The ideas of men who speculate upon the dismemberment of the empire seem generally turned toward 3 confederacies, one consisting of the 4 northern, another of the 4 middle, and a third of the 5 southern states. There is little probability that there would be a greater number. According to this distribution, each confederacy would comprise an extent of territory larger than that of the Kingdom of Great Britain. No well-informed man will suppose that the affairs of such a confederacy can be properly regulated by a government less comprehensive in its organs or institutions than that which has been proposed by the convention. When the dimensions of a state attain to a certain magnitude, it requires the same energy of government and the same forms of administration which are requisite in one of much greater extent. This idea admits not of precise demonstration, because there is no rule by which we can measure the momentum of civil power necessary to the government of any given number of individuals, but when we consider that the island of Britain, nearly commensurate with each of the supposed confederacies, contains about 8 millions of people, and then we reflect upon the degree of authority required to direct the passions of so large a society to the public good, we shall see no reason to doubt that the like portion of power would be sufficient to perform the same task in a society far more numerous. Basically saying that, like, if you have 4 different governments or 3 different governments, you're going to have to duplicate funds so much to make all these different governments. But if you just have one larger government, there's no reason to think that like one large government would take more money than a smaller one, as long as it's performing the same functions. That's basically the argument here, right? Civil power, properly organized and exerted, is capable of diffusing its force to a very great extent and can, in a manner, reproduce itself in every part of a great empire by a judicious arrangement of subordinate institutions. This essay is arguing that one massive government costs just a bit more than multiple smaller governments, meaning it is more efficient and less tax burdensome to have a single federal government as opposed to multiple smaller confederacies. The supposition that each confederacy into which the states would be likely to be divided would require a government not less comprehensive than the one proposed will be strengthened by another supposition, more probable than that which presents us with three confederacies as the alternative to a general union. If we attend carefully to geographical and commercial considerations in conjunction with the habits and prejudices of the different states, we shall be led to conclude that in case of disunion, they will most naturally league themselves under two governments. Before Eastern states, wait, hold on. If we attend carefully to geographical, in conjunction with the habits and prejudices of the different states, that in case of disunion, they will most naturally league themselves under two governments. I'm saying that a more probable thing naturally is we would lend ourselves to two governments, and it's going to argue why we shouldn't. Maybe. The four Eastern states, from all the causes that form the links of national sympathy and connection, may with certainty be expected to unite. New York, situated as she is, would never be unwise enough to oppose a feeble and unsupported flank to the weight of that confederacy. There are other obvious reasons that would facilitate her accession to it. New Jersey is too small a state to think of being a frontier, in opposition to this still more powerful combination, nor do there appear to be any other obstacles to her admission into it. Even Pennsylvania would have strong inducements to join the Northern League. An active foreign commerce on the basis of her own navigation is her true policy and coincides with the opinions and dispositions of her citizens. The more southern states, from various circumstances, may not think themselves much interested in the encouragement of navigation. They may prefer a system which would give unlimited scope to all nations to be the carriers as well as the purchasers of their commodities. Pennsylvania may not choose to confound her interests in a connection so adverse to her policy. As she must at all events be a frontier, she may deem it most consistent with her safety to have her exposed side turned toward the weaker power of the South rather than towards the stronger power of the Northern Confederacy. This would give her the fairest chance to avoid being the Flanders of America. I don't know what Flanders is in reference to. Whatever may be the determination of Pennsylvania, if the Northern Confederacy includes New Jersey, there is no likelihood of more than one confederacy to the south of that state. Ned Flanders from The Simpsons. Gotcha. One of the things that's brought up over and over again is the different economies between the North and the South and how the South might have different interests than that of the North. So having a unified federal government is good because it unifies the interests between the two parties instead of having them basically at each other's throats, right? It was an area in Belgium that was politically contested between great powers in Europe. Gotcha. Oh, this is a super short one. Nothing can be more evident than that the 13 states will be able to support a national government better than 1/2 or 1/3 or any number less than the whole. This reflection must have great weight in obviating that objection to the proposed plan, which is founded on the principle of expense. An objection, however, which, when we come to take a near review of it, will appear in every light to stand on mistaken ground. If, in addition to the consideration of a plurality of civil lists, we take into view the number of persons who must necessarily be employed to guard the inland communication between the different confederacies against illicit trade, and who in time will infallibly spring up out of the necessities of revenue, and if we also take into view the military establishments, which it has been shown would unavoidably result from the jealousies and conflicts of the several nations into which the states would be divided, we shall clearly discover that a separation would be not less injurious to the economy than to the tranquility, commerce, revenue, and liberty of every part. This is, okay. There's not really much new in here. I feel like we've basically gone over this before, but surely tax duplication is inevitable with 50 states. This was only meant for 13 states. No, I was just saying that, like, if you had one federal government over 50 states, it's about as big as a federal government over 20 states or 30 states or 40 states. That, like, a federal government that rules over 50 states or 50 million people is not necessarily twice the size of a federal government that rules over 25 states or 25 million people. That, like, a single unifying federal government is going to be cheaper to deploy resources rather than having three different whole ass federal governments or whatever. Not gonna lie, the three whole ass anything sounds better than one. Wait, why? Okay, good one. Yeah, just anything. Did I cover the Syrian rebels taking Aleppo yet? No, I didn't read anything about that today. Is it worth it? How long is this one? Let me do 2 more of these. So we release it up to 15 and then I'll read a story or 2 about that today. Objections to the proposed constitution from extent of territory answered. Ooh, this is from Madison. When will you publish your notes on the Federalist Papers? Oh, I don't know. I don't even have them in the right folder yet. What are you doing with my notes? There's just no way that these are useful to anybody. I'm just like writing like a sentence about what each one is over. I can't believe that these are going to be useful to anybody, but Jesus, I don't like, what do you plan on doing with these? We have seen the necessity of the Union as our bulwark against foreign danger, as the conservator of peace among ourselves, as the guardian of our commerce and other common interests, as the only substitute for those military establishments which have subverted the liberties of the old world, and as the proper antidote for the diseases of faction which have proved fatal to other popular governments, and of which alarming symptoms have been betrayed by our own. Wait. As a proposed antidote, all that remains within this branch of our inquiries is to take notice of an objection that may be drawn from the great extent of country which the Union embraces. A few observations on this subject will be the more proper, as it is perceived that the adversaries of the new Constitution are availing themselves of the prevailing prejudice with regard to the practicable sphere of Republican administration in order to supply, by imaginary difficulties, the want of those solid objections which they endeavor in vain to find. Okay, so basically saying we've already made like good debate points for why if we join as a union, we're gonna be better against foreign enemies. We don't fight amongst ourselves. It's good for like our own like economies and militaries. But now we need to talk about, I'm guessing this is like the expansion westward from extent of territory, I guess. The error which limits Republican government to a narrow district has been unfolded and refuted in preceding papers. I remark here only that it seems to owe its rise and prevalence chiefly to the confounding of a republic with a democracy, applying to the former reasonings drawn from the nature of the latter. The true distinction between these forms was also adverted to on a former occasion. It is that in a democracy, the people meet and exercise the government in person. In a republic, they assemble and administer it by their representatives and agents. A democracy, consequently, will be confined to a small spot. A republic may be extended over a large region. To this accidental source of the error may be added, so what is the error? The error to which limits Republican government to a narrow district has been unfolded and refuted in preceding papers. Remark here that it seems the confounding of republic with the democracy. Oh, so basically, people are saying we can't have a huge republic because, like, how are we going to vote on everything? But they're saying, like, well, you know, we don't have to have individual people voting on everything because we have a republic. That's what our representatives are for, I'm thinking, yeah. To this accidental source of the error may be added the artifice of some celebrated authors whose writings have had a great share in forming the modern standard of political opinions. Being subjects either of an absolute or limited monarchy, they have endeavored to heighten the advantages. Being subjects either of an absolute or limited monarchy, they have endeavored to heighten the advantages or palliate the evils of those forms by placing in comparison the vices and defects of the republican, and by citing as specimens of the latter the turbulent democracies of ancient Greece and modern Italy. So basically saying, like, oh, some people who have enjoyed living under monarchies are trying to say that, like, well, look how bad, like, republicanism is as a form of government, which is a republic is just, and republicanism is just forms of government where you have representatives basically that represent the people as opposed to a monarchy, right? Or a monarch. Under the confusion of names, it has been an easy task to transfer to a republic observations applicable to a democracy only, and among others, the observation that it can never be established but among a small number of people living within a small compass of territory. Do you think that you may be the only person in history that says you should read the Federalist Papers to actually read them all? Oh, maybe, who knows? I'm sure other people have, okay? Just have to believe. Such a fallacy, also we've only gotten through like 14, okay? Such a fallacy may have been the less perceived, as most of the popular governments of antiquity were of the democratic species. And even in modern Europe, to which we owe the great principle of representation, no example is seen of a government wholly popular and founded, at the same time, wholly on that principle. If Europe has the merit of discovering this great mechanical power in government by the simple agency of which the will of the largest political body may be concerned, and its force directed to any object which the public good requires, America can claim the merit of making the discovery the basis of unmixed and extensive republics. It is only to be lamented that any of her citizens should wish to deprive her of the additional merit of displaying its full efficacy in the establishment of the comprehensive system now under her consideration. So Europe has used like republics in limited degrees in the past, but like America is considering a republic that not only has like the republic itself is encompassing like a large area, but also the executive, I guess, would be elected as well, right? Because it's force directed to any object which the public requires, also an executive. Basically, I guess there's no, prior to the United States, I don't think there was any republic that was this large, that didn't have a monarchical component, right? A monarchical, there's a word in there that, in this paper for the, well, and then we'll see, I guess, how he argues. As the natural limit of a democracy is that distance from the central point which will just permit the most remote citizens to assemble as often as their public functions demand, and will include no greater number than can join in those functions. So the natural limit of a republic is that distance from the center, which will barely allow the representatives to meet as often as may be necessary for the administration of public affairs. Can it be said that the limits of the United States exceed this distance? It will not be said by those who recollect that the Atlantic coast is the longest side of the Union, that during the term of 13 years, the representatives of the states have been almost continually assembled, and that the members from the most distant states are not chargeable with greater intermissions of attendance than those from the states in the neighborhood of Congress. Madison points out that over the prior 13 years, representatives from each state government have indeed been successfully meeting in Congress. That we may form a juster estimate with regard to this interesting subject, let us resort to the actual dimensions of the Union. The limits as fixed by the Treaty of Peace are, on the east, the Atlantic, on the south, the latitude of 31 degrees, on the west, the Mississippi, and on the north, an irregular line running in some instances beyond the 45th degree. Wait, they already had latitude? They didn't have longitude though, right? Because they didn't know how, nobody just... Wait, who was the first guy to go around the world? Why do I feel like the answer is Magellan? I don't even know why. I feel like I learned this second grade. First guy to circumnavigate the Earth in 1522. Never mind. Okay, is in 1492. This is so much earlier. 250. When was latitude, longitude created? Did they just instantly, as soon as he went? How do you even measure between oceans? I feel like this would be so fucking difficult. Okay, 3rd century. Okay, good for you, Chief. John Harrison's invention of a chronometer that could keep time at sea with sufficient accuracy to be practical for determining longitude was recognized in 1773 as first enabling determination of longitude at sea. Damn. Okay. The southern shore of Lake Erie lies below that latitude. Computing the distance between the 31st and 45th degrees, it amounts to 973 common miles. Computing it from 31 to 42 degrees to 764 miles and a half. Oh my God. Cringe, math nerds. The mean distance from the Atlantic to the Mississippi does not probably exceed 750 miles. On a comparison of this extent with that of several countries in Europe, the practicability of rendering our system commensurate to it appears to be demonstrable. It is not a great deal larger than Germany, where a diet representing the whole empire is continually assembled, or than Poland before the late dismemberment, where another national diet was the depository of the supreme power. Passing by France and Spain, we find that in Great Britain, inferior as it may be in size, the representatives of the northern extremity of the island have as far to travel to the National Council as will be required of those in the most remote parts of the Union. He argues that there are large countries in Europe that already have members in their parliamentary bodies. Okay. Favorable as this view of the subject may be, some observations remain which will place it in a light still more satisfactory. In the first place, it is to be remembered that the general government is not to be charged with the whole power of making and administering laws. Its jurisdiction is limited to certain enumerated objects which concern all the members of the republic, but which are not to be attained by the separate provisions of any. The subordinate governments, which can extend their care to all those other subjects, which can be separately provided for, will retain their due authority and activity. Were it proposed by the plan of the convention to abolish the governments of the particular states, its adversaries would have some ground for their objection, though it would not be difficult to show that if they were abolished, the general government would be compelled, by the principle of self-preservation, to reinstate them in their proper jurisdiction. A second observation to be made is that the immediate objects of the federal constitution is to secure the union of the 13 primitive states, which we know to be practicable, and to add to them such other states as may arise in their own bosoms, I think, or in their neighborhoods, which we cannot doubt to be equally practicable. Oh, sorry, I should be explaining these. This part up here is basically saying that, remember, the federal government is only tasked with dealing with federal things. We don't expect people from all the governments to come together and make rules or laws about the individual states themselves. That's still up to the governments of the individual states. The arrangements that may be necessary for those angles and fractions of our territory which lie on our northwestern frontier must be left to those whom further discoveries and experience will render more equal to the task. A second observation to be made is that the immediate object of the federal constitution secure the union. Okay, which will other states which may arise in their own bosoms or in their neighborhoods, which we cannot doubt to be. So basically, more states are going to be added to the union, and I guess states near those new states are going to know more about those states, I guess. Talking about the arrangements. Let it be remarked in the third place that the intercourse throughout the union will be facilitated by new improvements. Roads will everywhere be shortened, and kept in better order, accommodations for travelers will be multiplied and ameliorated, and interior navigation on our eastern side will be opened throughout, or nearly throughout, the whole extent of the 13 states. The communication between the western and Atlantic districts and between different parts of each will be rendered more and more easy by those numerous canals with which the beneficence of nature has intersected our country, and which art finds its so little difficult to connect and complete. Having a unified government will make basically unified like roads and travel and shit easier, I guess. Pretty obvious. A fourth and still more important consideration is that is almost every state will, on one side or another, be a frontier and will thus find, in regard to its safety, an inducement to make some sacrifices for the sake of the general protection. So the states which lie at the greatest distance from the heart of the Union, and which, of course, may partake least of the ordinary circulation of its benefit, will be at the same time immediately contiguous to foreign nations and will consequently stand on particular occasions in greatest need of its strength and resources. So basically, we would all be fighting together against foreign invaders, I guess. It may be inconvenient for Georgia or the states forming our western or northeastern borders to send their representatives to the seat of government, but they would find it more so to struggle alone against an invading enemy, or even to support alone the whole expense of those precautions which may be dictated by the neighborhood of continual danger. If they should derive less benefit, therefore, from the Union in some respects than the less distant states, they will derive greater benefit from it in other respects, and thus the proper equilibrium will be maintained throughout. I submit to you, this is a good one, I think. I like this quote. Good one. Nice. Yes. That's exactly what I wanted. I submit to you, my fellow citizens, these considerations in full confidence that the good sense which has so often marked your decisions will allow them their due weight and effect, and that you will never suffer difficulties, however formidable in appearance or however fashionable the error on which they may be founded, to drive you into the gloomy and perilous scene into which the advocates for disunion would conduct you. Hearken not to the unnatural voice which tells you that the people of America, knit together as they are by so many cords of affection, can no longer live together as members of the same family, can no longer continue the mutual guardians of their mutual happiness, can no longer be fellow citizens of one great, respectable, and flourishing empire. Hearken not to the voice which petulantly tells you that the form of government recommended for your adoption is a novelty in the political world, that it has never yet had a place in the theories of the wildest projectors, that it rashly attempts what is impossible to accomplish. No, my countrymen, shut your ears against this unhallowed language, shut your hearts against the poison which it conveys, the kindred blood which flows in the veins of American citizens, the mingled blood which they have shed in defense of their sacred rights, consecrate their union and excite horror at the idea of their becoming aliens, rivals, enemies. And if novelties are to be shunned, believe me, the most alarming of all novelties, the most wild of all projects, the most rash of all attempts, is that of rendering us in pieces in order to preserve our liberties and promote our happiness. But why is the experiment of an extended republic to be rejected merely because it may comprise what is new? It is not the glory of the people of America that, whilst they have paid a decent regard to the opinions of former times and other nations, that they have not suffered a blind veneration for antiquity, for custom, or for names, to overrule the suggestions of their own good sense, the knowledge of their own situation, and the lessons of their own experience. To this manly spirit, posterity will be indebted for the possession, and the world for the example, of the numerous innovations displayed on the American theater in favor of private rights and public happiness. Just because this is a new project, just because it's something that hasn't been done before, doesn't mean that we shouldn't even try. We've already shed blood basically to form the Union, and that the worst thing we could possibly do would be to render us into pieces, I guess. Okay. To this manly spirit, To this manly spirit, posterity will be indebted for the possession, and the world for the example, of the numerous innovations displayed on the American theater in favor of private rights and public happiness. Had no important step been taken by the leaders of the Revolution for which a precedent could not be discovered, no government established of which an exact model did not present itself, the people of the United States might, at this moment, have been numbered among the melancholy victims of misguided counsels, must at best have been laboring under the weight of some of those forms which have crushed the liberties of the rest of mankind. Basically, that we've already created something that's like pretty unique, and that if we would have gone, the ways of other societies, we would just have a bunch of random councils that would suck shit, I think, basically. Happily for America, happily we trust for the whole human race, they pursued a new and more noble course. They accomplished a revolution which has no parallel in the annals of human history. They reared the fabrics of governments which have no model on the face of the globe. They formed the design of a great confederacy which is incumbent on their successors to improve and perpetuate. If their works betray imperfections, we wonder at the fewness of them. If they erred most in the structure of the Union, this was the work most difficult to be executed. This is the work which has been new modeled by the act of your convention, and it is that act on which you are now to deliberate and to decide. There might be issues, but they're not issues that we can't overcome, right? Sure, there might be some problems, but geez, look at how few problems there are compared to what they could be, I guess, basically, right? Okay. The 13 colonies have created something grand and great after the revolution. It would be horrible to mankind to see it fail or dissolve into tribes or councils, I guess, basically. Sure. Okay. One more, and then we'll do Syria, Aleppo stuff. I can't wait for this to react to the musical. I've never watched the musical. Fuck musicals. Except for Joker 2, because the Joker is the representative of our generation. I heard a lefty content creator say that you said you would support Nikki Haley over Kamala. Are they just straight up lying? I've never said that. I said that like maybe I would consider it, but like for Trump, I don't even have to consider the policies on the left. I just would automatically support basically any left-leaning candidate. But for Nikki Haley, I don't know, depending on what she ran for, I would at least like read her policy positions, but I would still probably, I imagine I would still probably support Kamala Harris, would be my guess. But I would at least like consider it, but I doubt it would go very far. Bernie or Trump? Yeah, obviously Bernie. Wouldn't even be close. Jesus. All right. Okay. A Hamilton one. The insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve the Union. What did Hamilton mean with unmixed when he said, America can claim the merit of making the discovery, the basis of unmixed and extensive republics in the paper you just read? What did he mean? Are you asking me like a quiz, or are you asking me, when he says unmixed, my guess is he means like republics that don't have limited monarchies as a part of them. I think that's what he means there, right? That I think most of the republics that have existed so far have either been small or they've been republics that have like a non-absolute monarchy as a component to it, I think. I think that's my guess. In the course of the preceding papers, I have endeavored, my fellow citizens, to place before you, in a clear and convincing light, the importance of union to your political safety and happiness. I've unfolded to you, these things were published probably, what, weekly, I think? Or probably not weekly, because there's like 80 some papers, so maybe every few days, but that's why there's like a lot of summarizing at the beginning. It's like watching an anime over and over again. Okay. I've endeavored, my fellow citizens, to place before you in a clear and convincing light the importance of union to your political safety and happiness. I have unfolded to you a complication of dangers to which you would be exposed should you permit that sacred knot which binds the people of America together be severed or dissolved by ambition or by avarice, by jealousy or by misrepresentation. In the sequel of the inquiry through which I propose to accompany you, the truths intended to be inculcated, hold on. Inculcated. To instill, okay. The truths intended to be inculcated will receive further confirmation from facts and arguments hitherto unnoticed. If the road over which you will still have to pass should in some places appear to you tedious or irksome, you will recollect that you are in quest of information on a subject the most momentous which can engage the attention of a free people, that the field through which you have to travel is in itself spacious, and that the difficulties of the journey have been unnecessarily increased by the mazes with which sophistry has beset the way. Jesus. Basically, there's going to be a whole bunch of shit to think about. There's a lot of things to think about, but it's made even more complicated by the fact that there are sophists, there are liars that are telling lies on the way there. It will be my aim to remove the obstacles from your progress in as compendious a manner as it can be done without sacrificing utility to dispatch. Always trying to combine entertainment and education. Cute. In pursuance of the plan which I have laid down for the discussion of the subject, the point next in order to be examined is the insufficiency of the present Confederation to the preservation of the Union. It may perhaps be asked what need there is of reasoning or proof to illustrate a position which is not either controverted or doubted, to which the understandings and feelings of all classes of men assent, and which in substance is admitted by the opponents as well as by the friends of the new Constitution. Well, if it's so obvious, then why do we even have to debate this particular thing, right? Would be what some bad faith interlocutor would say. It must in truth be acknowledged that, however these may differ in other respects, they in general appear to harmonize in the sentiment, at least, that there are material imperfections in our nationalist system and that something is necessary to be done to rescue us from impending anarchy. The facts that support this opinion are no longer objects of speculation. They have forced themselves upon the sensibility of the people at large, and have at length extorted from those whose mistaken policy has had the principal share in precipitating the extremity at which we have arrived, or which we are arrived, a reluctant confession of the reality of those defects in the scheme of our federal government, which have been long pointed out and regretted by the intelligent friends of the Union. Jesus Christ. Basically, it's obvious now that there are problems with like a huge federal government. There's not much you can do to like you can't ignore these anymore, right? And everybody sees that these are like huge problems, right? We may indeed with propriety be said to have reached almost the last stage of national humiliation. There is scarcely anything that can wound the pride or degrade the character of an independent nation which we do not experience. Hold on, I shouldn't write some of this down. In this essay, Hamilton is arguing that the current federal government is not capable of, current federal government has obvious defects that are apparent to... Are there engagements to the performance of which we are held by every tie respectable among men? Are there engagements to the performance of which we are held by every tie respectable among men? Jesus. Okay. Is Hamilton always writing like this? Are we gonna have to fucking put on our 7 billion IQ brain? Are there engagements to the performance of which we are held by every tie? Are there engagements that are respectable among men? Engagements of performance. These are the subjects of constant and unblushing violation. Do we owe debts to foreigners and to our own citizens contracted in a time of imminent peril for the preservation of our political existence? These remain without any proper or satisfactory provision for their discharge. Oh, I understand. I'm so sorry. Okay. Basically, I believe that the Confederacy, my U.S. history around here is very bad, okay? And when I say bad, I mean like non-existent. The Confederacy basically made promises to other countries and to its own citizens that they're not even sure that the country can deal with, right? So like they owe debt, they borrowed money from their own citizens, they borrowed money from other countries, like there are engagements that, you know, they have to honor, you know, to other people and everything. So yeah, okay. These remain without any proper or satisfactory provision for their discharge. The current Confederacy has made promises, debt, etc., to its own citizens and foreign countries and foreigners and foreign agents. It is unable to compensate for, that it is unable to pay back. Have we valuable territories and important posts in the possession of a foreign power which, by express stipulations, ought long since to have been surrendered? These are still retained to the prejudice of our interests, not less than of our rights. Did we promise territories to like France or whatever to help us? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure. I'm not actually sure how much we promised for the Revolutionary War. These are still retained to the prejudice of our interests, not less than of our rights. Are we in a condition to resent or to repel the aggression? We have neither troops, nor treasury, nor government. Are we even in a condition to remonstrate with dignity? Remonstrate with dignity? Can we pay anything back? The just imputations on our own faith in respect to the same treaty ought first to be removed. The just imputations on our own faith in respect to the same treaty ought first to be removed. They also made agreements with the natives that they could keep land, which eventually the Fed had trouble keeping those agreements and would cause tension for the states and the Feds. Oh, maybe, yeah. Are we entitled by nature and compact to a free participation in the navigation of the Mississippi? Spain excludes us from it. Is public credit an indispensable resource in time of public danger? We seem to have abandoned its cause as desperate and irretrievable. Is commerce of importance to national wealth? Ours is at the lowest point of declension. Is respectability in the eyes of foreign powers a safeguard against foreign encroachments? The imbecility of our government even forbids them to treat with us. Our ambassadors abroad are the mere pageants of mimic sovereignty. Is a violent and unnatural decrease in the value of land a symptom of national distress? The price of improved land in most parts of the country is much lower than can be accounted for by the quantity of waste land at market, and can only be fully explained by that want of private and public confidence which are so alarmingly prevalent among all ranks, and which have a direct tendency to depreciate property of every kind. Is private credit the friend and patron of industry? That most useful kind which relates to borrowing and lending is reduced within the narrowest limits, and this still more from an opinion of insecurity than from the scarcity of money. Basically, these are just like all the issues. Like the country's basically fucked right now. There's a lot of bad shit going on a federal level, I guess, basically. To shorten an enumeration of particulars which can afford neither pleasure nor instruction, it may in general be demanded what indication is there of national disorder, poverty, and insignificance that could befall a community so peculiarly blessed with natural advantages as we are, which does not form a part of the dark catalog of our public misfortunes, befalling the current Confederacy, including its inability to form treaties, pay back its debts, borrow money, or take advantage, commerce, of the extensive natural resources available to it. The Confederacy referred to here has nothing to do with the Confederate States of America. No. This is the Confederacy. This is just the like the first government after the colonies rebelled against Great Britain. That has nothing to do with like the CSA or the Confederate States of America. I just was going taps the other day, right? Yeah, I already recorded that. Hopefully it's out within a couple weeks. I don't know how long it normally takes them to edit and publish shows. This is the melancholy situation to which we have been brought by those very maxims and counsels which would now deter us from adopting the proposed Constitution, and which, not content with having conducted us to the brink of a precipice, seem resolved to plunge us into the abyss that await us below. Here, my countrymen, impelled by every motive that ought to influence an enlightened people, let us make a firm stand for our safety, our tranquility, our dignity, our reputation. Let us at last break the fatal charm which has too long seduced us from the path of felicity and prosperity. I think, hold on.
Felicity.
Okay, sorry. Felicity and prosperity. It is true, as has been before observed, that facts, too stubborn to be resisted, have produced a species of general assent to the abstract proposition that there exist material defects in our national system, but the usefulness of the concession on the part of the old adversaries of federal measures is destroyed by a strenuous opposition to a remedy upon the only principles that can give it a chance of concession. Jesus, this is such a complicated sentence. Okay. Yes, it is true that we have acknowledged defects in our current government, but who the fuck cares? What's the usefulness of that concession if you're not even, if you're going to oppose a remedy that will help us cure the problem? Jesus, what a fucking, my God. What a way to say that. While they admit that the government of the United States is destitute of energy, they contend against conferring upon, who are they? They contend against conferring upon it those powers which are requisite to supply that energy. They seem still to aim at things repugnant and irreconcilable, at an augmentation of federal authority without a diminution of state authority, at sovereignty in the Union and complete independence in the members. They still, in fine, seem to cherish with blind devotion the political monster of an imperium in imperio. This renders a full, hold on, what the fuck does this mean? Is a government power or sovereignty within a government power or sovereignty. Okay. This has to do with like saying like, well, we don't want to give up any rights as states. Basically, I think. All of their power and independence and solve the problems that the Confederacy is currently facing. This renders a full display of the principal defects of the Confederation necessary in order to show that the evils we experience do not proceed from minute or partial imperfections, but from fundamental errors in the structure of the building, which cannot be amended otherwise than by an alteration in the first principles and main pillars of the fabric. The great and radical vice in the Constitution of the existing Confederation is in the principle of legislation for states or governments in their corporate or collective capacities, and as contradistinguished from the individuals of which they consist. Though this principle does not run through all the powers delegated to the Union, yet it pervades and governs those on which the efficacy of the rest depends. The great and radical vice in the Constitution is the principle of legislation for states or governments in their corporate or collective capacities, contradistinguished from the individuals. Okay, I think this is saying that the big issue with the Confederacy is that it's not, you can't have these big legislative bodies that represent everybody while also representing like individual like states and everything, having like individual citizens. Like you have to make some sacrifices, I think, at some point, I think is what we're talking about, I think. Except as to the rule of appointment, the United States has an indefinite discretion to make requisitions for men and money, but they have no authority to raise either by regulations extending to the individual citizens of America. The consequence of this is that though in theory their resolutions concerning those objects are laws, constitutionally binding on the members of the Union, yet in practice they are mere recommendations which the states observe or disregard at their option. Okay, so the Confederate government has like no power basically. Yeah. The government can say shit, but like states at the end of the day are like, fuck it, yes or no, but they can't really enforce any of it. Yeah. It is a singular instance of this capriciousness of the human mind that after all of the admonitions we have had from experience on this head, there should still be found men who object to the new Constitution for deviating from the principle which has been found the bane of the old, and which is in itself evidently incompatible with the idea of government, a principle, in short, which, if it is to be executed at all, must substitute the violent and sanguinary agency of the sword to the mild influence of the magistracy. Magistracy? Okay. Jesus. So stop imagining a giant federal government to be this evil thing that's ruling by the sword and just like, it's just a body of bureaucratic shit, I guess. Okay. Would the Articles of Confederation be worth looking into? Should we read them? I don't know, maybe we will. I want to read the Constitution after these, but how long are the Articles of Confederation? I imagine they're probably a lot shorter than the Constitution, right? Because it sounds like they didn't do fuck all, would be my guess. Oh yeah, this is it, right? I'm guessing? They're like the length. I think the Articles of Confederation, the entire Articles of Confederation are shorter than this Federalist paper we're reading. If this is all of them right here, truly. It seems like split. Why is everybody coxing? Good one. Okay. Well, hopefully it's transfers. It moved the file. Preferences. Yeah. Wait. Oh, we'll see. Wait. Okay. Wait, hold on. I'm paranoid this isn't gonna... Oh, okay. It is. Whew. All right. Considerations of peace and justice to the impulse of any... Wait. Till we... Oh, okay. There is nothing absurd or impracticable in the idea of a league or alliance between independent nations for certain defined purposes, precisely stated in a treaty regulating all the details of time, place, circumstance, and quantity, leaving nothing to future discretion, and depending for its execution on the good faith of the parties. Compacts of this kind exist among all civilized nations, subject to the usual vicissitudes of peace and war, of observance and non-observance, as the interest or passions of the contracting powers dictate. In the early part of the present century, there was an epidemical rage in Europe for this species of compacts, from which the politicians of the times fondly hoped for benefits which were never realized. With a view to establishing the equilibrium of power and the peace of that part of the world, all the resources of negotiations were exhausted, and triple and quadruple alliances were formed, but they were scarcely formed before they were scarcely formed before they were broken, giving an instructive but afflicting lesson to mankind how little dependence is to be placed on treaties which have no other sanction than the obligations of good faith, and which oppose general considerations of peace and justice to the impulse of any immediate interest or passion. Basically, this is saying that, like, because I guess people who are arguing in favor of the Confederacy are going to say, well, listen, we already have like a giant Confederacy. This should be fine. And I think, or we can like make it treaties between the states. But this is saying, like, if you want to make treaties and stuff, like everybody across Europe has made tons and tons of treaties. But as soon as it's inconvenient for a particular country, they break the treaty, right? Like, as soon as a treaty is established, scarcely after the establishment of a treaty, it's broken because people are like, well, fuck this, who cares? So arguing again in favor of the federal government over the establishment of just simple treaties that can be broken, whenever the fuck. If the particular states in this country are disposed to stand in a similar relation to each other and to drop the project of a general discretionary superintendence, the scheme would indeed be pernicious and would entail upon us all the mischiefs which have been enumerated under the first head, but it would have the merit of being at least consistent and practicable, abandoning all views towards a confederate government. This would bring us to a simple alliance, offensive and defensive, and would place us in a situation to be alternate friends and enemies of each other, as our mutual jealousies and rivalships, nourished by the intrigues of foreign nations, should prescribe to us. Some argue that Hamilton argues that if we simply rely upon treaties, they will be formed and broken quickly, depending upon the conveniences or passions of each confederacy. Wait, did my YouTube bandwidth drop? No, I don't think so. Okay. But if we are unwilling to be placed in this perilous situation, if we still adhere to the design of a national government, or, which is the same thing, of a superintending power under the direction of a common council, we must resolve to incorporate into our plan those ingredients which may be considered as forming the characteristic difference between a league and a government. We must extend the authority of the Union to the persons of the citizens and the only proper objects of government. Placed in this perilous situation, if we still adhere to the design of national government. Okay, so the difference between a league and a government is that the authority of the Union has to extend to people within the government, not just, I guess, the states themselves. So, okay. Jesus, is this the longest Federalist paper? Okay. Government implies the power of making laws. It is essential to the idea of a law that it be attended with a sanction, or in other words, a penalty or punishment for disobedience. If there be no penalty annexed to disobedience, the resolutions or commands which pretend to be laws will, in fact, amount to nothing more than advice or recommendation. This penalty, whatever it may be, can only be inflicted in two ways: by the agency of the courts and ministers of justice, or by military force, by the coercion of the magistracy, or by the coercion of arms.
Magistracy.
Magistracy. Okay. The first kind can evidently apply only to men. The last kind must of necessity be employed against bodies, politics, or communities or states. Bodies politic or communities or states. It is evident that there is no process of a court by which the observance of the law can, in the last resort, be enforced. Sentences may be denounced against them for violations of their duty, but these sentences can only be carried into execution by the sword. In an association where the general authority is confined to the collective bodies of the communities that compose it, every breach of the laws must involve a state of war, and the military execution must become the only instrument of civil obedience. Such a state of things can certainly not deserve the name of government, nor would any prudent man choose to commit his happiness to it. Basically saying, if you've got treaties between like different states and somebody like breaks a treaty, what do you have to do? You go to war with them? Is that how we want to like govern ourselves? Obviously not. We probably want governments that can like punish people for breaking laws, right? There was a time when we were told that breaches by the state of the regulations of the federal authority were not to be expected, that a sense of common interest would preside over the conduct of the respective members and would beget a full compliance with all the constitutional requisitions of the Union. This language at the present day would appear as wild as a great part of what we now hear from the same quarter will be thought when we shall have received further lessons, from that best oracle of wisdom, experience. Okay. This language at the present day would appear as wild as a great part of what we now hear from the same quarter will be thought when we shall have received further lessons from the best oracle of wisdom, experience. Basically saying these guys are fucking retarded, and the more time goes on, the more retarded we see they are, I think, right? It at all times betrayed an ignorance of the true springs by which human conduct is actuated, and belied the original inducements to the establishment of civil power. Why has government been instituted at all? Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. That's a good quote. I like this whole quote, actually. It at all times betrayed an ignorance of the true springs by which human conduct is actuated, and belied the original inducements to the establishment of civil power. Why has government been instituted at all? Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. Has it been found that bodies of men act with more rectitude or greater disinterestedness than individuals? The contrary of this has been inferred by all accurate observers of the conduct of mankind, and the inference is founded upon obvious reasons. Regard to reputation has a less active influence when the infamy of a bad action is to be divided among a number than when it is to fall singly upon one. A spirit of faction, which is apt to mingle its poison in the deliberations of all bodies of men, will often hurry the persons of whom they are composed into improprieties and excesses for which they would blush in a private capacity. The founding fathers really hated, I guess, like groupthink, or like lots of people's getting together and doing shit. The passions of men, if you were like confronted one-on-one with these things, you would blush in a private capacity. But in large groups of people, factions, they talk a lot about factions, can be rushed towards passionate, stupid decisions. In addition to all this, there is, in the nature of sovereign power, an impatience of control that disposes those who are invested with the exercise of it to look with an evil eye upon all external attempts to restrain or direct its operations. From this spirit it happens that in every political association which is formed upon the principle of uniting in a common interest a number of lesser sovereignties, there will be found a kind of eccentric tendency in the subordinate or inferior orbs, by the operation of which there will be a perpetual effort in each to fly off from the common center. This tendency is not difficult to be accounted for. It has its origin in the love of power. Power controlled or abridged is almost always the rival and enemy of the power by which it is controlled or abridged. This simple proposition will teach us how little reason there is to expect that the persons entrusted with the administration of the affairs of the particular members of a confederacy will at all times be ready, with perfect good humor and an unbiased regard to the public weal, to execute the resolutions or decrees of the general authority. See, this is why I split all my mods up into different groups now, instead of having everybody mod everything. The reverse of this results from the constitution of human nature. Basically, this is saying that that every time you have like large groups of people that are formed, there will always be like some inferior or smaller part that will want to fly off and form its own thing or be corrupted by its power to do its own thing. I guess something like that, basically, right? If, therefore, the measures of the Confederacy cannot be executed without the intervention of the particular administrations, there will be little prospect of their being executed at all. The rulers of the respective members, whether they have a constitutional right to do it or not, will undertake to judge of the propriety of the measures themselves. That you can't have a confederacy like making rules to all the states because people are just going to look at it and go, oh, well, that doesn't benefit me, fuck you, and then they won't do it. They will consider the conformity of the thing proposed or required to their immediate interests or aims. They're just going to think about it selfishly, like, well, does this benefit me or not? The momentary conveniences or inconveniences that would attend its adoption. All of this will be done, and in a spirit of interested and suspicious scrutiny, without that knowledge of national circumstances and reasons of state, which is essential to a right judgment, and with that strong predilection in favor of local objects, which can hardly fail to mislead the decision. The same process must be repeated in every member of which the body is constituted, and the execution of the plans framed by the councils of the whole will always fluctuate on the discretion of the ill-informed and the prejudiced opinion of every part. Those who have been conversant in the proceedings of popular assemblies, who have seen how difficult it often is, where there is no exterior pressure of circumstances, to bring them to harmonious resolutions on important points, will readily concede how impossible it must be to induce a number of such assemblies, deliberating at a distance from each other, at different times and under different impressions, long to cooperate in the same view and pursuits. Damn, okay, true. Federacies would evaluate every federal dictate based on how beneficial it would be to follow it at a precise moment in time and lead to disharmony. Okay. In our case, the concurrence of 13 distinct sovereign wills is requisite under the Confederation to the complete execution of every important measure that proceeds from the Union. It has happened as was to have foreseen. It has happened as was to have been foreseen. The measures of the Union have not been executed. The delinquencies of the states have, step by step, matured themselves to an extreme which has, at length, arrested all the wheels of the national government and brought them to an awful stand. Congress, at this time, scarcely possess the means of keeping up the forms of administration, till the states can have time to agree upon a more substantial substitute for the present shadow of a federal government. Things did not come to this desperate extremity at once. The causes which have been specified produced at first only unequal and disproportionate degrees of compliance with the requisitions of the Union. The greater deficiencies of some states furnished the pretext of example and the temptation of interest to the complying or to the least delinquent states. Why should we do more in proportion than those who are embarked with us in the same political voyage? Why should we consent to bear more than our proper share of the common burden? These were suggestions which human selfishness could not withstand, and which even speculative men who looked forward to remote consequences could not, without hesitation, combat. Each state, yielding to the persuasive voice of immediate interest or convenience, has successively withdrawn its support till the frail and tottering edifice seems ready to fall upon our heads and to crush us beneath its ruins. Jeez, okay. Why we need a federal government. Sync notes. Why? I don't know what you need these for. I don't even have these like in proper folders yet. If you really want me to, change, select all, and new.
Any of this happens, we say it's wrong. And this pardon of the president to his...
No one cares. All right, I'm just going to read this. I'm curious. Fuck, why not wait till we get to fucking 74 on this? So we'll just read it. This is from Hamilton. This is Federalist number 74. The President of the United States is to be, this is called the command of the military and naval forces and the pardoning power of the executive. The President of the United States is to be the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. The propriety of this provision is so evident in itself, and it is, at the same time, so consonant to the precedents of the state constitutions in general, that little need be said to explain or enforce it. Even those of them which have, in other respects, coupled the chief magistrate with a council, have for the most part concentrated the military authority in him alone. Of all the cares or concerns of government, the direction of war most peculiarly demands those qualities which distinguish the exercise of power by a single hand. The direction of war implies the direction of the common strength, and the power of directing and employing the common strength forms a usual and essential part in the definition of the executive authority. Quote, the president may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective officers, end quote. This I consider as a mere redundancy in the plan, as the right for which it provides would result of itself from from the office. He's just arguing for a strong executive that can do shit quick without getting fucked by losers. He is also to be authorized to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Humanity and good policy conspire to dictate that the benign prerogative of pardoning should be as little as possible fettered or embarrassed. The criminal code of every country partakes of so much of necessary severity that without an easy access to exceptions in favor of unfortunate guilt, justice would wear a countenance too sanguinary and cruel. As the sense of responsibility is always strongest in proportion as it is undivided, it may be inferred that a single man would be most ready to attend to the force of those motives which might plead for a mitigation of the rigor of the law, and least apt to yield to considerations which were calculated to shelter a fit object of its vengeance. The reflection that the fate of a fellow creature depended on his sole fiat would naturally inspire scrupulousness and caution. The dread of being accused of weakness or connivance would beget equal circumspection, though of a different kind. On the other hand, as men generally derive confidence from their numbers, they might often encourage each other in an act of obduracy, and might be less sensible to the apprehension of suspicion or censure for an injudicious or affected clemency. On those accounts, one man appears to be a more eligible dispenser of the mercy of government than a body of men. Basically saying that, I would have to know more of the, I think at this point, prior to the Constitution, I think, is Hamilton a guy who doesn't like political parties? Is he one of the guys who's like, don't ever have political parties? I guess his idea here is that like before before pardoning is like an actual power, I think that, or before pardoning is a power before there are political parties. The idea is nobody's really going to run around pardoning a bunch of people because everybody's going to accuse them of being like corrupt and weak and whatever. But that sometimes the law is just so aggressive and punishment so harsh that maybe one man should be able to provide some reprieve, basically, I guess. But I guess his idea here is that people would be using this power incredibly sparingly, I guess. The expediency of vesting the power of pardoning in the president has, if I mistake not, been only contested in relation to the crime of treason. This, it has been urged, ought to have depended upon the assent of one or both of the branches of the legislative body. I shall not deny that there are strong reasons to be assigned for requiring in this particular the concurrence of that body or of a part of it, as treason is a crime leveled at the immediate being of the society. When the laws have once ascertained the guilt of the offender, there seems a fitness in referring the expediency of an act of mercy towards him to the judgment of the legislature. And this ought the rather to be the case, as the supposition of the connivance of the chief magistrate ought not to be entirely excluded. But there are also strong objections to such a plan. It's basically saying that, I don't understand this. Treason is a crime leveled at the immediate being of the society. And once we figured out that they're guilty, it seems fair to say that an act of mercy should only belong to the legislature. A fitness in referring the expediency of an act of mercy towards him to the judgment of the legislature, and this ought the rather to be the case, as a supposition of the connivance of the judgment ought not to be entirely excluded. But there are also strong objections to such a plan. It is not to be doubted that a single man of prudence and good sense is better fitted in delicate conjunctures to balance the motives which may plead for and against the remission of the punishment than any numerous body whatever. It deserves particular attention that treason will often be connected with seditions which embrace a large proportion of the community, as lately happened in Massachusetts. In every such case, we might expect to see the representation of the people tainted with the same spirit which had given birth to the offense. And when parties were pretty equally matched, the secret sympathy of the friends and favorers of the condemned person, availing itself to the good nature and weakness of others, might frequently bestow impunity where the terror of an example was necessary. Okay, so this is saying if somebody was really driven so much to commit treason, then the same conditions might lead the legislature to pardon them. So this is why he's arguing for it also to be vested in the president as well. But on the other hand, when the sedition is proceeded from causes which had inflamed the resentments of the major party, they might often be found obstinate and inexorable when policy demanded a conduct of forbearance and clemency. But the principal argument for reposing the power of pardoning, in this case to the chief magistrate, is this. In seasons of insurrection or rebellion, there are often critical moments when a well-timed offer of pardon to the insurgents or rebels may restore the tranquility of the Commonwealth, and which, if suffered to pass unimproved, it may never be possible afterwards to recall. This is kind of interesting. So it's basically saying that maybe during critical moments, maybe it would be good if the president could pardon basically insurrectionists or traitors. It's interesting that this is written here because this exact thing came up after the Civil War, but it wasn't the president that offered the pardon. It was the legislature, right? It was Congress that approved a reprieve from Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which prohibited all the prior oath takers from ever holding office again. There was a blanket reprieve that was granted, but it came from the legislature, not from the president. So his prediction here would have been incorrect, but the dilatory process of convening the legislature or one of its branches for the purpose of obtaining its sanction to the measure would frequently be the occasion of letting slip the golden opportunity. The loss of a week, a day, an hour may sometimes be fatal. If it should be observed that a discretionary power, with a view of such contingencies, might be occasionally conferred upon the president, it may be answered in the first place. That is a questionable whether, in a limited constitution, that power could be delegated by law, and in the second place, that it would generally be impolitic beforehand to take any step which might hold out the prospect of impunity. A proceeding of this kind out of the usual course would be likely to be construed into an argument of timidity or of weakness and would have a tendency to embolden guilt. That you couldn't just temporarily give the president the power to pardon, it has to be absolute or something, because if you're just giving it and taking it, it'd be, I guess. It isn't really a prediction, it's just his argument. It can't be tested because the Constitution was ratified before an insurrection happened. Well, all of these things are predictions, right? Kind of. They're saying, look, this is how history's gone and this is how it would go, so this is why we ought to do this thing, right? One thing you have to keep in mind, too, a couple things to keep in mind is that, one, their presidential elections, I believe, when the Constitution was founded, we'll get this, I think they were different. They were significantly different. I don't even know if the states had popular votes. I don't think they did. The electors, I think, were just chosen by the state legislatures, and then the electors got together, and then they didn't get together. I'm sorry, they got together, but they didn't all vote on the same person. They voted for who each of them thought was correct to vote for. I think they also had or at least Alexander Hamilton. I don't know if the rest of them felt this way, but Hamilton really hates groups of people. He really thinks that when you get like more than two people together to make a decision, they turn into fucking retards. So he's very big on like structures of government and individual responsibility and shit, I think. Seems like it. Hamilton's belief was that embarrassment would prevent presidents from exercising this power too frequently, I guess. Okay. Well, to divest. The same subject continued, the insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve the Union. The tendency of the principle of legislation for states or communities in their political capacities, as it has been exemplified by the experiment we have made of it, is equally attested by the events which have befallen all other governments of the Confederate kind, of which we have any account in exact proportion to its prevalence in those systems. The tendency... Okay. The confirmations of this fact will be worthy of a distinct and particular examination. I shall content myself with barely observing here that of all the confederacies of antiquity, which history has handed down to us, the Lycian and Achaean leagues, as far as there remains vestiges of them, appear to have been most free from the fetters of that mistaken principle, and were accordingly those which have best deserved and have most liberally received the applauding suffrages of political writers. The tendency of the principle of legislation for states or communities and political classes as exemplified by the experiment we have made of it. Oh, so he's going to compare, I guess, like other older like republics basically and see which ones are doing the best, basically. Yeah. Okay. This exceptional principle may, as truly as emphatically, be styled the parent of anarchy. It has been seen that delinquencies in the members of the Union are its natural and necessary offspring, and that whenever they happen, the only constitutional remedy is force, and the immediate effect of the use of it, civil war. It remains to inquire how far, I think one of the problems so far is that like the Articles of Confederation, they basically do nothing. If you've got like an issue with somebody or an issue with the state, there's no like power of enforcement. You basically just have to take your military and go blow people up. There's like fuck all you can do. It remains to inquire how far so odious an engine of government in its application to us would even be capable of answering its end. If there should not be a large army constantly at the disposal of the national government, it would either not be able to employ force at all, or, when this could be done, it would amount to a war between parts of the Confederacy concerning the infractions of a league in which the strongest combination would be most likely to prevail, whether it consisted of those who supported or of those who resisted the general authority. So arguing that the federal government needs to be strong and able to enforce things, otherwise the state with the biggest army would basically just say, fuck you, we're going to do whatever we want, get bent. It would rarely happen that the delinquency to be redressed would be confined to a single member, and if there were more than one who had neglected their duty, similarity of situation would induce them to unite for common defense. Oh, this is kind of funny. This is basically a prediction of the Civil War, right? If something was pissing off a state so bad that it needed to resist the Federation, confederation of states, then there'd probably be multiple states that would want to work together for it, which I guess is kind of like the Civil War, right? Independent of this motive of sympathy, if a large and influential state should happen to be the aggressing member, it would commonly have weight enough with its neighbors to win over some of them as associates to its cause. Specious arguments of danger to the common liberty could easily be contrived. Plausible excuses for the deficiencies of the party could, without difficulty, be invented to alarm the apprehensions, inflame the passions, and conciliate the goodwill even of those states which were not chargeable with any violation or omission of duty. So one state could like fuck up really bad, and it could basically say to smaller states around it, like, hey, listen, like, I know that we fucked up, but they're coming for you next, okay? This would be the more likely to take place, as the delinquencies of the larger members might be expected sometimes to proceed from an ambitious premeditation in their rulers, with a view of getting rid of all external control upon their designs of personal aggrandizement. The more likely to take place, the delinquencies of the larger members might be expected to proceed from an ambitious premeditation. Okay, yeah. The better to effect which it would presumable they would tamper beforehand with leading individuals in the adjacent states. If associates could not be found at home, recourse would be had to the aid of foreign powers, who would seldom be disinclined to encouraging the dissension of a confederacy from the firm union of which they had so much to fear. Oof. So if states were having problems with each other, smaller states could be basically kind of like a larger state could get a smaller state to like join it in its rebellion. Or if they couldn't find friends at home, maybe a state could align itself with a foreign power who would be glad to see, obviously, the fall of the United States, right? When the sword is once drawn, the passions of men observe no bounds of moderation. The suggestions of wounded pride, the instigations of irritated resentment, would be apt to carry the states against which the arms of the Union were exerted to any extremes necessary to avenge the affront or to avoid the disgrace of submission. The first war of this kind would probably terminate in a dissolution of the Union. What is this? So Hamilton argues that too weak a federal government, or federal military, I guess, would induce large states to rise up against other states, possibly gathering smaller states or foreign enemies up with them in their rebellion. This may be considered as the violent death of the Confederacy. Its more natural death is what we now seem to be on the point of experiencing, if the federal system be not speedily renovated in a more substantial form. It is not probable, It is not probable, considering the genius of this country, that the complying states would often be inclined to support the authority of the Union by engaging in a war against the non-complying states. The complying states would often be... They would always be more ready to pursue the milder course of putting themselves upon an equal footing with the delinquent members by an imitation of their example. And the guilt of all would thus become the security of all. Our past experience has exhibited the operation of this spirit in its full light. There would, in fact, be an insuperable difficulty in ascertaining when force could, with propriety, be employed. In the article of pecuniary contribution,
Pecuniary.
relating to or consisting of money. Okay. In the article of pecuniary contribution, which would be the most usual source of delinquency, it would often be impossible to decide whether it had proceeded from disinclination or inability, meaning you could never figure out, is somebody not paying me back because they can't or because they don't want to? And it's probably hard to figure out the difference between these two. The pretense of the latter would always be at hand, and the case must be very flagrant in which its fallacy could be detected with sufficient certainty to justify the harsh expedient of compulsion. It is easy to see that this problem alone, as often as it should occur, would open a wide field for the exercise of factious views, of partiality, and of oppression in the majority that happen to prevail in the National Council. It seems to require no pains to prove that the states ought not to prefer a national constitution which could only be kept in motion by the instrumentality of a large army continually on foot to execute the ordinary requisitions or decrees of the government. And yet, this is the plain alternative involved by those who wish to deny it the power of extending its operations to individuals. Such a scheme, if practicable at all, would instantly degenerate into a military despotism, but it would be found in every light impracticable. The resources of the Union would not be equal to the maintenance of an army considerable enough to confine the larger states within the limits of their duty, nor would the means ever be furnished of forming such an army in the first instance. Whoever considers the populousness and strength of several of those states singly at the present juncture and looks forward to what they will become, even at the distance of half a century, will at once dismiss as idle and visionary any scheme which aims at regulating their movements by laws to operate upon them in their in their collective capacities and to be executed by a coercion applicable to them in the same capacities. A project of this kind is little less romantic than the monster-taming spirit which is attributed to the fabulous heroes and demigods of antiquity. So we have to find a way to enforce the Constitution or national constitution without just like using a huge rolling military over and over again, basically, right? I think. Even in those confederacies which have been composed of members smaller than many of our counties, the principle of legislation for sovereign states supported by military coercion has never been found effectual. It has rarely been attempted to be employed, but against the weaker members, and in most instances, attempts to coerce the refractory and disobedient have been the signals of bloody wars, in which one half of the Confederacy has displayed its banners against the other half. The result of these observations to an intelligent mind must be clearly this: that if it be possible at any rate to construct a federal government capable of regulating the common concerns and preserving the general tranquility, it must be founded, as to the objects committed to its care, upon the reverse of the principle contended for by the opponents of the proposed Constitution. It must carry its agency to the persons of the citizens. It must stand in need of no intermediate legislations, but must itself be empowered to employ the arm of the ordinary magistrate to execute its own resolutions. The majesty of the national authority must be manifested through the mediums of the courts of justice. The government of the Union, like that of each state, must be able to address itself immediately to the hopes and fears of individuals, and to attract to its support those passions which have the strong influence upon the human heart. It must, in short, possess all the means and have a right to resort to all the methods of executing the power with which it is entrusted that are possessed and exercised by the government of the particular states. So is this arguing for like federal authority over individual U.S. citizens as well? Basically, I think is what this is like arguing, right? I think this is what it's arguing. To this reasoning, it may perhaps be objected that if any state should be disaffected to the authority of the Union, or maybe this is arguing essentially for the supremacy of federal law, maybe over state law. To this reasoning, it may perhaps be objected that if any state should be disaffected by the authority of the Union, it could at any time obstruct the execution of its laws and bring the matter to the same issue of force with the necessity of which the opposite scheme is reproached. The plausibility of this objection will vanish the moment we avert to the essential difference between a mere non-compliance and a direct and active resistance. If the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, they have only not to act or to act evasively, and the measure is defeated. This neglect of duty may be disguised under affected but unsubstantial provisions, so as not to appear, and of course not to excite any alarm in the people for the safety of the Constitution. The state leaders may even make a merit of their surreptitious invasions of it on the ground of some temporary convenience, exemption, or advantage. So it's saying we can't rely on like state legislatures to implement federal law for citizens of the states, I think, basically, right? But if the execution of the laws of the national government should not require the intervention of the state legislatures, if they were to pass into immediate operation upon the citizens themselves, the particular governments could not interrupt their progress without an open and violent exertion of an unconstitutional power. No omissions nor evasions would answer the end. They would be obliged to act, and in such a manner as would leave no doubt that they have encroached on the national rights. An experiment of this nature would always be hazardous in the face of a constitution in any degree competent to its own defense, and of a people enlightened enough to distinguish between a legal exercise and an illegal usurpation of authority. The success of it would require not merely a factious majority in the legislature, but the concurrence of the courts of justice and the body of the people. If the judges were not embarked in a conspiracy with the legislature, they would pronounce the resolution of such a majority to be contrary to the supreme law of the land, unconstitutional and void. If the people were not tainted with the spirit of their state representatives, they, as the natural guardians of the Constitution, would throw their weight into the national scale and give it a decided preponderancy in the contest. Attempts of this kind would not often be made with a levity or rashness, because they could seldom be made without danger to the authors, unless in cases of tyrannical exercise of the federal authority. Okay. If opposition to the national government should arise from the disorderly conduct of refractory or seditious individuals, it could be overcome by the same means which are daily employed against the same evil under the state governments. The magistracy, being equally the ministers of the law of the land, from whatever source it might emanate, would doubtless be as ready to guard the national as the local regulations from the inroads of private licentiousness. As to those partial commotions and insurrections, which sometimes disquiet society from the intrigues of an inconsiderable faction or from sudden or occasional ill humors that do not infect the great body of the community, the general government can command more extensive resources for the suppression of disturbances of that kind than would be in the power of any single member. And as to those mortal feuds which, in certain conjunctures, spread a conflagration through the whole nation, or through a very large proportion of it, proceeding either from weighty causes of discontent given by the government, or from the contagion of some violent popular paroxysm, they do not fall within any ordinary rules of calculation. When they happen, they commonly amount to revolutions and dismemberments of empire. No form of government can always either avoid or control them. It is in vain to hope to guard against events too mighty for human foresight or precaution, and it would be idle to object to a government because it could not perform impossibilities. That's cute. Okay, so this is basically arguing for supremacy, but enforcing federal law with the military is not desirable. So the best outcome would be all state governments to recognize the supremacy of federal law and not require further state legislature action to implement it, I guess. Okay. Reading Federalist number 17. Good luck. Are you enrolled in this? No. The same subject continued the insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve the Union. An objection of a nature different from that which has been stated and answered in my last address may perhaps be likewise urged against the principle of legislation for the individual citizens of America. Against the principle of legislation. It may be said that it would tend to render the government of the Union too powerful. Oh, and the last one he talked a lot about how the federal government should be able to make laws and rules that apply to the ordinary citizens of the states, basically, right? It may be said that it would tend to render the government of the Union too powerful and to enable it to absorb those residuary authorities which it might be judged proper to leave with the states for local purposes. Allowing the utmost latitude to the love of power which any reasonable man can require, I confess I am at a loss to discover what temptation the persons entrusted with the administration of the general government could ever feel to divest the states of the authorities of that description. The regulation of the mere domestic police of a state appears to me to hold out slender allurements to ambition. Commerce, finance, negotiation, and war seem to comprehend all the objects which have charms for minds governed by that passion, and all the powers necessary to those objects ought, in the first instance, to be lodged in the national depository. So he's saying things that states are interested in, why would the federal government care? Things that the federal government is interested in, the federal government naturally care about. So commerce, finance, negotiation, and war, these seem to be things that a federal government would love to deal with, and so they will deal with it. But like, would the federal government care about divesting a state from like police? Why would the federal government have an interest in that? The administration of private justice between the citizens of the same state, the supervision of agriculture and of other concerns of a similar nature, all those things, in short, which are proper to be provided for by local legislation, can never be desirable cares of a general jurisdiction. It is therefore improbable that there should exist a disposition in the federal councils to usurp the powers with which they are connected, because the attempt to exercise those powers would be as troublesome as it would be nugatory, and the possession of them for that reason would contribute nothing to the dignity, to the importance, or to the splendor of the national government. So this prediction is pretty wrong, but Hamilton argues that a federal government would simply have no desire to be in control of things state governments are more easily in control of, citing agriculture and policing powers as examples. But let it be admitted for argument's sake that mere wantonness and lust of domination would be sufficient to beget that disposition. Still, it may be safely affirmed that the sense of the constituent body of the national representatives, or, in other words, the people of the several states, would control the indulgence of so extravagant an appetite. So he's saying the representatives, the people in Congress, would control the federal government and not be wacky and wild when it comes to that. It will always be far more easy for the state governments to encroach upon the national authorities than for the national government to encroach upon the state authorities. This is probably just wrong. I think history has shown us right. The proof of this proposition turns upon the greater degree of influence which the state governments, if they administer their affairs with uprightness and prudence, will generally possess over the people, a circumstance which at the same time teaches us that there is an inherent and intrinsic weakness in all federal constitutions, and that too much pains cannot be taken in their organization to give them all the force which is compatible with the principles of liberty. The superiority of influence in favor of the particular governments would result partly from the diffusive construction of the national government, but chiefly from the nature of the objects to which the attention of the state administrations would be directed. Again, that states would just, the things that states are interested in, their government would be more naturally suited to deal with. The federal government can't do fuck all, I guess, and shouldn't do fuck all, and wouldn't want to do fuck all. It is a known fact in human nature that its affections are commonly weak in proportion to the distance or diffusiveness of the object. Upon the same principle that a man is more attached to his family than to his neighborhood than to the community at large, the people of each state would be apt to feel stronger bias towards their local governments than towards the government of the Union, unless the force of that principle should be destroyed by a much better administration of the latter. The strong propensity of the human heart would find powerful auxiliaries in the objects of state regulation. The variety of more minute interests. One thing that's probably changing this a lot too is like the advent of like radio, TV, and then internet obviously makes us feel much more connected to each other and then gives us a much stronger opinion about federal matters than it would about like state matters as well, right? Which is why a lot of this ends up being not the way that it turned out to be, right? The variety of more minute interests, which will necessarily fall under the superintendence of the local administrations, and which will form so many rivulets of influence running through every part of the society, cannot be particularized without involving a detail too tedious and uninteresting to compensate for the instruction it might afford. There is one, this is saying that like, if the federal government wanted to control some state affair, it would be like, so that to do this would just be so particularized, it wouldn't even be worth it. The federal government wouldn't have an interest or whatever, right? Or is what his argument would be. There is one transcendent advantage belonging to the province of the state governments, which alone suffices to place the matter in a clear and satisfactory light. I mean, the ordinary administration of criminal and civil justice. This, of all others, is the most powerful, most universal, and most attractive source of popular obedience and attachment. It is that which, being the immediate, invisible guardian of life and property, having its benefits and its terrors in constant activity before the public eye, regulating all those personal interests and familiar concerns to which the sensibility of individuals is more immediately awake, contributes, more than any other circumstance, to impressing upon the minds of the people affection, esteem, and reverence towards the government. This great cement of society, which will diffuse itself almost wholly through the channels of the particular governments, independent of all other causes of influence, would ensure them so decided an empire over their respective citizens as to render them at all times a complete counterpoise and, not unfrequently, dangerous rivals to the power of the Union. He argues that the existence of individual judicial systems across each state would impress upon the individual citizens how important and relevant their own state governments are when it comes to administering to the states for state issues. The operations of the national government, on the other hand, falling less immediately under the observation of the mass of the citizens, the benefits derived from it will chiefly be perceived and attended to by speculative men. Relating to more general interests, they will be less apt to come home to the feelings of the people and, in proportion, less likely to inspire an habitual sense of obligation and an active sentiment of attachment. The reasoning on this head has been abundantly exemplified by the experience of all federal constitutions with which we are acquainted and of all others which have borne the least analogy to them. Though the ancient feudal systems were not, strictly speaking, confederacies, yet they partook of the nature of that species of association. There was a common head, chieftain, or sovereign, whose authority extended over the whole nation, and a number of subordinate vassals, or feudatories, who had large portions of land allotted to them, and numerous trains of inferior vassals, or retainers, who occupied and cultivated that land upon the tenure of fealty or obedience to the persons of whom they held it. Each principal vassal was a kind of sovereign within his particular domain. Is this word right?
Domain.
The consequences of this situation were a continual opposition to authority of the sovereign and frequent wars between the great barons or chief feudatories themselves. The power of the head of the nation was commonly too weak either to preserve the public peace or to protect the people against the oppressions of their immediate lords. This period of European affairs is emphatically styled by historians the times of feudal anarchy. When the sovereign happened to be a man of vigorous and warlike temper and of superior abilities, he would acquire a personal weight and influence which answered, for the time, the purpose of a more regular authority. But, in general, the power of the barons triumphed over over that of the prince, and in many instances his dominion was entirely thrown off, and the great fiefs were erected into independent principalities or states. In those instances in which the monarch finally prevailed over the vassals, his success was chiefly owing to the tyranny of those vassals over their dependents. The barons or nobles, equally the enemies of the sovereign and the oppressors of the common people, were dreaded and detested by both, till mutual danger and mutual interest effected a union between them, fatal to the power of the aristocracy. Had the nobles, by a conduct of clemency and justice, preserved the fidelity and devotion of their retainers and followers, the contest between them and the prince must almost always have ended in their favor, and the abridgment or subversion of the royal authority. So basically saying that, like, you might have had a prince or a king, but, like, ultimately the power was exerted on by individuals, by people that were more closely, like, literally in geography to the people, right? This is not an assertion founded merely in speculation or conjecture. Among other illustrations of its truth which might be cited, Scotland will furnish a cogent example. The spirit of clanship which was, at an early day, introduced into that kingdom, uniting the nobles and their dependents by ties equivalent to those of kindred, rendered the aristocracy a constant overmatch for the power of the monarch. Till the incorporation, with England subdued its fierce and ungovernable spirit and reduced it within those rules of subordination which a more rational and more energetic system of civil polity had previously established in the latter kingdom. The separate governments in a confederacy may aptly be compared with the feudal baronies, with this advantage in their favor that from the reasons already explained, they will generally possess the confidence and goodwill of the people, and with so important a support will be able effectually to oppose all encroachments of the national government. It will be well if they are not able to counteract its legitimate and necessary authority. It will be, okay. The points of similitude, similarities, consist in the rivalship of power applicable to both, and in the concentration of large portions of the strength of the community into particular deposits, in one case at the disposal of individuals, in the other case at the disposal of political bodies. A concise review of the events that have attended Confederate governments will further illustrate this important doctrine, and inattention to which has been the great source of our political mistakes and has given our jealousy a direction to the wrong side. This review shall form the subject of some ensuing papers. Okay. So this is an argument that state governments would never cede power to a federal government because naturally people wouldn't even trust the federal government. It's further away. State governments, like feudal lords, are always more likely to control the people, and the people to, like, give its power to the local feudal stuff or the local vassal stuff as opposed to a strong federal government or whatever, naturally speaking. But okay, no quotes from this one. The same subject continued, the insufficiency of the present confederation to preserve the union. Not too long. Among the confederacies of antiquity, the most considerable was that of the Grecian republics, associated under the Amphictyonic Council. Amphictyonic? Christ.
Amphictyonic.
Thank you for the AI pronunciation. From the best accounts transmitted of this celebrated institution, it bore a very instructive analogy to the present Confederation of the American States. The members retained the character of independent and sovereign states and had equal votes in the Federal Council. This council had a general authority to propose and resolve whatever it judged necessary for the common welfare of Greece, to declare and carry on war, to decide, in the last resort, all controversies between the members, to fine the aggressing party, to employ the whole force of the Confederacy against the disobedient, to admit new members. The Amphictyons were the guardians of religion and of the immense riches belonging to the temple of Delphos, where they had the right of jurisdiction in controversies between the inhabitants and those who came to consult the oracle. As a further provision for the efficacy of the federal powers, they took an oath mutually to defend and protect the united cities, to punish the violators of this oath, and to inflict vengeance on sacrilegious despoilers of the temple. Despoilers? 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 In theory and upon paper, this apparatus of power seems amply sufficient for all general purposes. In several material instances, they exceed the powers enumerated in the Articles of Confederation. The Amphictyons had in their hands the superstition of the times, one of the principal engines by which government was then maintained. They had a declared authority to use coercion against refractory cities, and were bound by oath to exert this authority on the necessary occasions. Very different, nevertheless, was the experiment from the theory. The powers, like those of the present Congress, were administered by deputies appointed wholly by the cities in their political capacities and exercised over them in the same capacities. Hence the weakness, the disorders, and finally the destruction of the Confederacy. The more powerful members, instead of being kept in awe and subordination, tyrannized successively over all the rest. Athens, as we learned from Demosthenes, was the arbiter of Greece 73 years. The Lacedaemonians, next governed it 29 years. At a subsequent period, after the Battle of Leuctra, the Thebans had their turn of domination. It happened, but too often, according to Plutarch, that the deputies of the strongest cities awed and corrupted those of the weaker, and that judgment went in favor of the most powerful party. This essay draws upon the history of the Greek republics, argues that the federal power they possessed or lacked was defining in their maintaining control over the entirety of the Confederacy, or of the Republic, I guess? I don't know. Of Greece. I don't know. I think so. Even in the midst of defensive and dangerous wars with Persia and Macedon, the members never acted in concert and were, more or fewer of them, eternally the dupes or the hirelings of the common enemy. The intervals of foreign wars were filled up by domestic vicissitudes, convulsions, and carnage. After the conclusions of the war with Xerxes, it appears that the Lacedaemonians, required that a number of the cities should be turned out of the Confederacy for the unfaithful part they had acted. The Athenians, finding that the Lacedaemonians would lose fewer partisans by such a measure than themselves and would become masters of the public deliberations, vigorously opposed and defeated the attempt. This piece of history proves at once the inefficiency of the Union, the ambition and jealousy of its most powerful members, and the dependent and degraded condition of the rest. The smaller members, though entitled by the theory of their system to revolve in equal pride and majesty around the common center, had become, in fact, satellites of the orbs of primary magnitude. Had the Greeks, said the Millet, been as wise as they were courageous, they would have been admonished by experience of the necessity of a closer union, and would have availed themselves of the peace which followed the success against the Persian arms to establish such a reformation. Instead of this obvious policy, Athens and Sparta, inflated with the victories and the glory they had acquired, became first rivals and then enemies, and did each other infinitely more mischief than they had suffered from Xerxes. Their mutual jealousies, fears, jealousies, fears, hatreds, and injuries ended in the celebrated Peloponnesian War, which itself ended in the ruin and slavery of the Athenians who had begun it. As a weak government, when not at war, is ever agitated by internal dissensions, so these never failed to bring on fresh calamities from abroad. The Phocians, having plowed up some consecrated ground belonging to the temple of Apollo, the Amphictyonic Council, according to the superstition of the age, imposed a fine on the sacrilegious offenders. The Phocians, being abetted by Athens and Sparta, refused to submit to the decree. The Thebans, which others of the cities, undertook to maintain the authority of the Amphictyons and to avenge the violated god. The latter, being the weaker party, invited the assistance of Philip of Macedon, who had secretly fostered the contest. Philip gladly seized the opportunity of executing the designs he had long planned against the liberties of Greece. By his intrigues and bribes, he won over to his interests the popular leaders of several cities. By their influence and votes, gained admission into the Amphictyonic Council, and by his arts and arms, made himself master of the Confederacy. Lacedaemonian, is that how I pronounce it? One of the interesting themes of all of the Federalist Papers is one of the biggest worries of all of the founding father people is this idea of internal strife being co-opted by external enemies. Funny parallels to today. But such were the consequences of the fallacious principle on which this interesting establishment was founded. Had Greece, says a judicious observer on her fate, been united by a stricter confederation and persevered in her union, she would have never worn the chains of Macedon and might have proved a barrier to the vast projects of Rome. The Achaean League, as it is called, was another society of Grecian republics, which supplies us with valuable instruction. The union here was far more intimate and its organization much wiser than in the preceding instance. It will accordingly appear that that though not exempt from a similar catastrophe, it is by no means equally deserved. It. The cities composing this league retained their municipal jurisdiction, appointed their own officers, and enjoyed a perfect equality. The Senate, in which they were represented, had the sole and exclusive right of peace and war, of sending and receiving ambassadors, of entering into treaties and alliances, of appointing a chief magistrate or praetor, as he was called, who commanded their armies, and who, with the advice and consent of 10 of the senators, not only administered the government in the recess of the Senate, but had a great share in its deliberations when assembled. According to the primitive constitution, there were 2 praetors associated in the administration, but on trial a single one was preferred. The chief magistrate is the praetor. It appears that the cities had all the same laws and customs, the same weights and measures, and the same money, but how far this effect proceeded from the authority of the federal council is left in uncertainty. It is said only that the cities were in a manner compelled to receive the same laws and usages. When Lacedaemon was brought into the league by Philippomen, it was attended with an abolition of the institutions and laws of Lycurgus and an adoption of those of the Achaeans. I don't know how to pronounce any of these fucking stupid names. The Amphictyonic Confederacy, of which she had been a member, left her in the full exercise of her government and her legislation. This circumstance alone proves a very material difference in the genius of the 2 systems. It is much to be regretted that such imperfect monuments remain of this curious political fabric. Could its interior structure and regular operation be ascertained, it is probable that more light would be thrown by it on the science of federal government than by any of the like experiments with which we are acquainted. Okay, hold on. Okay. Too many people. Jesus. It is much to be regretted that such imperfect monuments remain of this curious political fabric. Could its interior structure and regular... okay. One important fact seems to be witnessed by all the historians who take notice of Achaean affairs. It is that as well after the renovation of the league by Aratus, as before its dissolution by the arts of Macedon, there was infinitely more of moderation and justice in the administration of its government, and less of violence and sedition in the people, than were to be found in any of the cities exercising singly all the prerogatives of sovereignty. The Abbé Mabley, in his observations on Greece, says that the popular government, which was so tempestuous elsewhere, caused no disorders in the members of the Achaean Republic because it was there tempered by the general authority and laws of the Confederacy. We are not to conclude too hastily, however, that faction did not, in a certain degree, agitate the particular cities, much less that a due subordination and harmony reigned in the general system. The contrary is sufficiently displayed in the vicissitudes and fate of the Republic. Whilst the Amphictyonic Confederacy remained, that of the Achaeans, which comprehended the less important cities only, made little figure on the theater of Greece. When the former became a victim to Macedon, the latter was spared by the policy of Philip and Alexander. Under the successors of these princes, however, a different policy prevailed. The arts of division were practiced among the Achaeans. Each city was seduced into a separate interest, and the union was dissolved. Some of the cities fell under the tyranny of Macedonian garrisons, others under that of usurpers springing out of their own confusions. Shame and oppression ere long awaken their love of liberty. A few cities were united. Their example was followed by others as opportunities were found of cutting off their tyrants. The league soon embraced almost the whole Peloponnesus. Macedon saw its progress, but it was hindered by internal dissensions from stopping it. All Greece caught the enthusiasm and seemed ready to unite in one confederacy when the jealousy and envy in Sparta and Athens of the rising glory of the Achaeans threw a fatal damp on the enterprise. The dread of the Macedonian power induced the league to court the alliance of the kings of Egypt and Syria, who, as successors of Alexander, were rivals of the king of Macedon. This policy was defeated by Cleomenes, king of Sparta, who was led by his ambition to make an unprovoked attack on his neighbors, the Achaeans, and who, as an enemy to Macedon, had interest enough with the Egyptian and Syrian princes to effect a breach of their engagements with the league. Jesus, I don't know any of this Greek history at all, but okay. The Achaeans were now reduced to the dilemma of submitting to Cleomenes, or of supplicating the aid of Macedon, its former oppressor. The latter expedient was adopted. The contest of the Greeks always afforded a pleasing opportunity to that powerful neighbor of intermeddling in their affairs. A Macedonian army quickly appeared. Cleomenes was vanquished. The Achaeans soon experienced, as often happens, that a victorious and powerful ally is but another name for a master. All that their most abject compliances could obtain from him was a toleration of the exercise of their laws. Philip, who was now on the throne of Macedon, soon provoked by his Aetolians and Athenians, erected the standard of opposition, finding themselves Though thus supported, unequal to the undertaking, they once more had recourse to the dangerous expedient of introducing the succor of foreign arms. The Romans, to whom the invitation was made, eagerly embraced it. Philip was conquered, Macedon subdued. A new crisis ensued to the League. Dissensions broke out amongst its members. These the Romans fostered. Callicrates and other popular leaders became mercenary instruments for inveigling their countrymen. The more effectually to nourish discord and disorder the Romans had, to the astonishment of those who confided in their sincerity, already proclaimed universal liberty throughout Greece. With the same insidious views, they now seduced the members from the League by representing to their pride the violation it committed on their sovereignty. By these arts, this union, the last hope of Greece, the last hope of ancient liberty, was torn into pieces, and such imbecility and distraction introduced that the arms of Rome found little difficulty in completing the ruin which their arts had commenced. The Achaeans were cut to pieces, and Achaia loaded with chains, under which it is groaning at this hour. I have thought it not superfluous to give the outlines of this important portion of history, both because it teaches more than one lesson, and because, as a supplement to the outlines of the Achaean constitution, it emphatically illustrates the tendency of federal bodies rather to anarchy among the members than to tyranny in the head. Jesus Christ. Okay. I imagine if you know more Greek history, maybe the people at the time did, or knew more about the ongoings, that it would be this would be more sensible. But I'm guessing these are all just like examples of how